I open the door carefully, because doors here do more than divide weather. They choose it. Mind the threshold. The floor rolls a little, not from age, but ambition. The castle prefers walking to staying. And today its stride has the confidence of a hill that has finally learned where it ends. Kettle, please behave. Calcifer, lower your voice. We have company. I am Markl. I sweep the soot, count the spoons, and translate wizard into breakfast. If you sit on the stool by the table, keep 1 foot ready. The wobble is a resident, not a floor. And we respect long-term tenants. This brass handle is our grammar. The collar has 4 colours. Turn it to green and the door opens on the high fields above market chipping, where the wind combs the grass so neatly you feel underdressed. Blue lets out to Port Haven, all salt and rope and nets, like handwriting on the air. Red, when Howl permits it, opens into Kingsbury, where streets polish your boots out of sheer discipline. Black is for places we visit only when courage has had its tea. I am not allowed to touch black without Howl, and I keep that rule the way sailors keep their knots. Calcifer lounges in the grate like a cat that learned to be fire and never regretted it. He is a fallen star with a contract, which is a polite word for a promise that bites. He likes bacon more than flattery, and will pretend not to hear you until you pretend not to need him. He huffs when I feed him pine. He purrs for applewood. Lately he has burned a little bluer, the colour of keeping secrets on purpose. If he grumbles at you, place the kettle on his hottest tongue and ask whether rumours think they are weather. He respects a well-placed question. Howl descends the stairs the way a storm decides to be local. His hair negotiates with humidity. His sleeves practice theatre. He has a way of making a room taller by standing still. Market chipping calls him heartless, with the fondness towns reserve for those who once improved a Tuesday simply by passing through it. I am his apprentice, because someone must translate the miraculous into chores. Refill the bottles, fold the sky out of his sleeves. Remember that bread takes longer than thunder. On the morning that matters, I answer a knock expecting fish or news. Instead, an old woman stands there with a hat that has learned to behave and eyes that have never once agreed to be tired. She says, "Good morning," in a tone that forgives the night for trying. I tell her we are not a charity. It is the kind of sentence hearths dislike. Calcifer spits. The kettle scolds me with steam. The old woman steps past me anyway, and the house, which is wiser than its inhabitants, arranges itself as if it has recognized a former owner. She moves like someone who trusts furniture to become better when asked. She wipes a shelf with the authority of rain approving a window. She speaks to Calcifer as if he were a necessary uncle, opinionated but loyal. The flame leans toward her in spite of himself, and then pretends it was only a draught. She tidies the table by asking it to remember its shape. She lifts a pan with the steadiness of someone who has cooked through storms without naming them. Later I will learn a witch folded time over her and made her wear the wrong years. But titles arrive after habits announce themselves. For now she is simply a person who believes hot water is the beginning of most salvations. Sophie Hatter, the town will say, if asked. Eldest sister, destined for ordinary, maker of hats that improved strangers' reflections. The narrator in me apprentices are allowed 2 sentences of third-person per day notes that she arrives cursed into age and discovers, in the privacy of her bones, the kind of freedom that comes from not asking permission. She introduces herself without bargaining chips. Howl arrives, late and bright, and says his name as if it were a chord. He looks at the new order of dust and pretends to be offended. Sophie hands him a spoon with a request to taste. He does. Acceptable, he pronounces, which in this house means keep the person who made it. Soon the brass handle learns her touch. Green, she says, and we step into the fields. The hat shop where she grew up watches us from the corner like an old thought trying not to interrupt. We do not go in. Later, she says, with the tenderness of a promise that knows furniture may need time to forgive. Letty, her sister at the bakery, gives us buns we did not pay for and news we did not ask for. Sugar and hope, she tells me, and I nod as if I have just signed a treaty with appetite. A scarecrow hops from a ditch and bows. Sophie calls him Turnip Head, with the courtesy one owes a stranger who has decided to help. He follows us home the way loyalty practices before anyone believes in it. In the kitchen, Sophie hangs her shawl on our peg, as if claiming tenancy by manners alone. She surveys the room, declares corners in need of redemption, and recruits the broom. Calcifer groans about draughts of justice and then burns warmer. Howl circles his mirrors, choosing which face to argue with. I inventory our small republic of tools, jars labelled by my hand and Sophie's better penmanship, vials with corks that sigh, charms sleeping in string. War hums like a distant hive on the edge of town talk. Posters appear, recruiting verbs that prefer not to be yelled. The red notch grows restless. The black notch pretends not to listen. When rain traps us, Howl's vanity revolts, and green slime attempts a coup in the bathroom. He declares tragedy in 3 languages. Soap agrees. I brace for dramatics. Calcifer eats the spectacle like candy. Sophie fetches a bucket and a tone of voice that makes despair reconsider. Up, she says, to both wizard and mess. We can be miserable after we are tidy. She means it. Floors obey. Howl sulks into obedience and then, to his credit, laughs at himself first. I decide that laughter is a tool and add it to the drawer with string and spare keys. By evening, the castle learns to sit. The legs shorten their stride. Shelves sigh in the accent of wood, remembering trees. Windows admit the sky's apology for earlier weather. Howl writes letters that sound, to my ear, like negotiations with conscience. Sophie mends a cuff, and while her needle argues kindly with cloth, the years on her face loosen like buttons that were never meant to be so tight. Calcifer mutters to the kettle about contracts and hearts and other things we agree not to name while the soup is simmering. The door, at rest, gleams. I polish its plate with my sleeve and feel it choose me back. In this house, we thank objects out loud. We also thank silences. The silence now is kind, like a library that has decided secrets are better shared tomorrow. I set out 3 cups because tea prefers odd numbers. Sophie pours, as if gravity were a partner worth praising. Howl, barefoot. A rare surrender balances his chair on 2 legs and looks younger than rumour allows. I rewrite the day in my notebook. Eggs, soap, rosemary, discretion. We do not speak of the witch of the waste, not directly. Her name stalks the town in fashionable shoes. It does not need our hallway as a runway. Still, when the wind presses against the panels, the castle listens the way brave people listen to danger, without volunteering to be audience. We practice hope like scales on a piano every day until the fingers remember music without instructions. 2 small intervals, because even apprentices are allowed a breath. First, I burn toast so thoroughly Calcifer tries to adopt it. Sophie laughs and shows me the distance between bread and flame where patience lives. Second, Turnip Head appears outside our moving window in rain, salutes, and is nearly carried off by the gesture. I fetch him a ribbon to tie his neck tighter. He nods, scandalized by gratitude. When night fully comes, the castle breathes. Houses do that if you are quiet enough. It is not the breath of lungs, it is the breath of beams and bolts and hinges and promises, of paths rehearsed in iron and will. I lie in my alcove that smells of pencil shavings, listening to 1,000 small loyalties keep watch. Sophie sleeps in a room she has made orderly enough for dreams to walk without tripping. Howl dreams I cannot decipher. They are written in a language his heart and his mirrors speak between them. Calcifer drowses with one blue eye open, just in case the moon forgets her duties and needs reminding. Tomorrow the green notch will open to grass, or the blue to salt, or the red to polished boots, and a voice that says wizard in a tone that implies leash. The black may open if courage insists. There will be crumbs to sweep, labels to rewrite, a kettle to encourage, a broom to apologize to, markets to visit, rumours to translate into recipes. If you return, knock softly and carry a sentence you are willing to repeat until it becomes true. The castle likes people who keep practicing. Kingsbury arrives with the red notch as if the door has been practicing posture. I turn the collar one careful click and the handle warms in my palm. Always. A sign that streets will try to be better than they are. Air slicks our hair as if it has opinions. Sophie steps through first, leaning on her stick with the elegance of someone who refuses to ask a staircase for mercy. I pocket my lists and follow. Kingsbury polishes your boots by accident. Its windows admire themselves. Its guards prefer nouns like order and refuse. The castle remains on its hill with Calcifer humming domestic weather. Here the world hums official. We have not come for a promenade. A letter folded like a decision arrived from Madame Suleiman, royal sorceress, collector of obedient wizards and of adjectives that look good in annual reports. She invites Howl to discuss service, which is a phrase that often mistakes the leash for a ribbon. Howl, refusing to be collared in person, has contrived an errand that sends us instead. Sophie in her grandmother skin, me in my apprentice manners. Be eyes, he told me, tying a ribbon in his hair with such concentration you would think it a treaty. And be a mouth if the room forgets its heart. We climb the broad steps to a palace that has never been late. Sophie regards its symmetry the way a baker regards a cake too proud to eat. A footman asks our names. Sophie provides them with a courtesy that implies she is doing the palace a favour by telling it anything at all. We wait in a room that smells of polished decisions and flowers that believe in themselves. Mirrors take attendance. Somewhere deeper, a clock practices discipline. Madame Suliman enters like a weather pattern that has chosen glass. Her smile is administrative. She recommends seats with a gesture that has been filed in triplicate. "You are attached to the wizard Howl," she says. "Attached," Sophie answers, the way households are attached to roofs. Suliman's eyebrows record the metaphor and set it aside for later. I take a breath sized for a footstool and try to say nothing foolish. The conversation is polite, the way chess pretends war is a matter of manners. Suliman praises Howl's brilliance and laments his reluctance to apply it to state needs. She suggests that war will arrive whether or not Howl is dressed for it. She alludes to the witch of the waste with that careful distaste bureaucracies reserve for rivals who do not file expense reports. Sophie listens with the silence of a woman who knows that people who announce competence are often measuring the room for curtains. A servant brings tea that tastes like good behaviour. Suliman's eyes, kind and exact, measure Sophie as if age could be an equation. "You are under a spell," she observes. "I've been under worse housekeeping," Sophie replies, "and the room, though it will deny it, smiles." The sorceress turns to me. "Apprentice," she says, "tell me of your master." I tell her about letters that try to be weather reports, about a bathroom that once attempted tragedy in green, about boots that walk a little taller when they find the right floor. I do not tell her the one thing that would please her most, that Howl's heart is a lever with leverage over the house. That is not mine to spend. We are shown a demonstration he politely calls proof. Mirrors wake and walk. Illusions kneel and grow real knees. A door opens onto nothing. And then, like a hausfrau with a sudden memory, reveals a tidy battlefield where toy soldiers rehearse destruction. Suliman's point is clean. Magic made obedient can become policy. Sophie, who makes obedience curtsy to dignity, watches without blinking. "Shall I tell him you have room on your leash?" she asks. The question wears lace and has teeth. A page delivers us into a corridor that ends in weather. The sky outside is so blue you suspect varnish. We make our way back to red, allow the door to learn us again, and step into the kitchen where Calcifer complains about being left alone with a moral universe. Howl descends 3 heartbeats later, reading us like letters he did not realize he had posted. "So," he says, "we tell him. We edit. We do not edit the part where Suliman's eyes were kind. Kind," he repeats, a connoisseur tasting a strange tea. He writes a letter that says no like a man who has practiced yes too often. I grind herbs for nerve. Sophie peels potatoes with the piety of a saint who understands supper. Outside, posters rehearse a parade. Inside, we rehearse gentleness. Turnip head bobs past the window, soaked and faithful. I throw him a rag. He bows, assembles dignity, and continues his wet loyalty. We could use more of his sort at court, I venture. Howl says, already rethreading the red notch's destination. He would improve the carpets. In the days that follow, the castle listens harder. Calcifer burns an exact, attentive blue. The black notch glowers like a door that wants to argue. Howl returns late, smelling of thunder and apology. He puts his boots side by side as if that could be an honest answer to an unfair question. Sophie quilts silence into warmth, and when she speaks, it is to ask whether anyone has watered the geranium in the window. We had forgotten the plant. It forgives us by surviving. One evening, I catch Calcifer watching Sophie with a gaze that has learned the cost of contracts. You could tell her, I say, too young to be wise and too loyal to be quiet. Calcifer pops and mutters about the nature of bargains. Some truths burn the house if you drop them, he says, and some truths warm it if you set them carefully. The kettle, eavesdropping, chooses to boil as punctuation. I pour and apologize to no one in particular. We make an excursion to Port Haven to breathe through salt. The fishermen have sharpened their talk into questions. When is the chief one? Sophie buys thread as if mending were a vote. I buy a packet of sweets with my own money, then pretend I am practicing diplomacy when I share them. Howl stares at the horizon as if it owes him a debt. He is a man who could give the sea a better idea of itself. He does not try. We come home with wet cuffs and the knowledge that walking is sometimes the bravest magic. But we still wonder whether a household's gentleness can survive the draught from policy, whether a broom, a pot of broth, and a star in a grate can instruct war in the use of hands. I wonder this while counting spoons as if arithmetic could enforce mercy. To let us breathe, 3 small reports from the Republic of Ordinary. First, I succeeded in poaching an egg without breaking its courage. Sophie called it a quiet miracle and asked for a second. Second, Howl repaired a hinge with so much flourish the door preened for an hour. Later he whispered sorry to the wood when he thought no one listened. Third, the geranium bloomed with the shy insistence of good news. We moved its pot to the sunnier sill and pretended plants like compliments. Night studies us with patience. The castle settles into its stride of not moving. In the grate, Calcifer keeps low company with embers that have learned to listen. Sophie writes a note to Letty and tucks it into the bread tin, because some messages travel better by rumour than by post. Howl stands by the door and touches each colour in order, as if reminding himself that leaving is not the only verb. He looks at black last and does nothing. I copy into my notebook a spell for courage with the parts I will omit carefully underlined, the syllables that turn bravery into noise. Sleep does not take me at once. I lie awake thinking how people in town call Howl heartless and how, today, Suleiman called him necessary. Both cannot be the same key, and yet the door opened. Sophie, in the next room, turns once and the floorboards bless her. Turnip Head thumps outside. A fox in the hedge debates it. Markets will open in the morning. War will too, perhaps. We will sweep, cook, label, listen. We will answer knocks. I have decided to keep a cup near the kettle for emergencies of kindness. The summons arrived with manners, a cream envelope that smelled faintly of starch and distance. Madame Suleiman requested an appearance, Howl's properly but accepted in the small print of power, a representative. The castle considered the letter the way tea considers lemon. Calcifer flared once and then agreed to keep the hearth sensible. We'll go together, Sophie decided, adjusting her shawl as one adjusts a sail for a wind the sky hasn't admitted yet. I packed practical magic, thread, salve, peppermints, a stub of chalk, and a pencil that had survived other audiences. The red notch warmed to our purpose. Kingsbury rose again, clean boots, clever windows. a sky that had practised being untroubled. We were met not by a footman, but by a dog of ambiguous loyalty and ambiguous breed short of leg, long of breath, carrying a message around his neck, as if paperwork should always be delivered by something with eyes. He led, we followed, and the palace unrolled carpets as if the day had been rehearsed. The staircase was the kind that performs opinion. Halfway up, the Witch of the Waste arrived at the bottom in a carriage upholstered in vanity and shadows. She stepped out in the authority of former beauty, her attendants arranged like commas. "After you," she said to us, with the ease of someone who expects the sentence to end in her favour regardless. Sophie, who fears no punctuation, answered with a nod and began to climb. The higher we rose, the more the air learned honesty. Steps collected fatigue like coins. The dog panted. I counted landings as if they were rungs on a ladder dropped from a complicated cloud. The witch, brilliant and brittle, began to shrink into the truth of her contract with her own appetites. By the time we reached the top, she was small in the way grandeur becomes when it is weighed without its decorations. Guards did not mock. Palaces prefer their morals tidy. The door opened. We were shown in. Madame Suleiman had arranged the room for candour. Light from the high windows, a table with nothing on it but tea and the invitation to be direct. Mirrors did their quiet work. "You have brought yourself," she said to Sophie, "and your apprentice." She looked past us, as if checking whether Howl came attached to our shadows. "He writes beautiful refusals," she added, amused. "He practices." Sophie did not sit until the dog, Suleiman's, of course, had arranged himself with dignity. "I have come to speak for our household," she said, using the pronoun that contains broom and fire and all the awkward repairs that bind people more than oaths do. Suleiman poured tea as if the liquid were a statement too. "War is not a rumour," she said. "We require the efficient." She said, "require" with the softness bureaucrats reserve for words they could make louder. I knew enough to be quiet. The Witch of the Waste, installed in a chair by the window, fanned herself with a hand that had learned humility on the staircase. "Dear," she said, almost kindly, "you cannot keep him hidden from weather." Sophie's answer travelled the short bridge between patience and steel. "He is not hidden. He is busy." Mirrors, being fair by profession, considered this. Suleiman inclined her head toward a wall that became a room, that became a demonstration. Illusions stepped forward expecting praise. Wind performed obedience without losing its accent. A flock of paper birds negotiated the geometry of order. If you wished, you could admire. If you have ever washed a teacup by hand, you have learned a harder magic. Sophie watched with the equality of someone who has scrubbed stairs and read storms and discovered both end. "Your howl runs from obligations," Suleiman said finally, not unkindly. "He also runs from himself." She touched the table with a fingertip, and the wood remembered the colour of truth. "His heart," she said, "is not where men usually keep them." That sentence crossed the air like a messenger without livery. I looked at Calcifer's absence and kept my mouth a better door than our handle. Sophie stood. "People," she said, "are not improved by leashes." It was not a speech, it was housekeeping. The witch made a sibilant sound that could have been sympathy or memory. The dog gathered himself with a grunt that translated in my head to yes. But do you have a plan for after the sentence? Suleiman's eyes, accurate as a sextant, softened by a degree. You love him, she said, as if checking arithmetic. I tidy after him, Sophie said, which in some dialects is the same confession. Outside the windows, clouds rehearsed an entrance. Inside, the air tilted a pressure change I have learned to call Howl. He arrived not through the door, but through arrangement. Shadows agreed to be cloak, light conceded cheekbones. Breeze admitted his signature. No trumpets, just the timing of someone who refuses to be late to the moment where kindness is required. Madame, he said, bowing like a man who knows how long a bow should be and refuses to offer you a centimetre more. You have my gratitude for not breaking the house while I was away. The dog wagged, betraying state secrets. Suleiman considered a smile and then permitted it. You make my rooms theatrical, she said. I prefer them honest. Howl granted the point with a hand. Then we agree, he replied. And for a moment the two of them, storm and instrument, shared a stillness that could have been a treaty if either had been willing to insult the word. Protocol wished to continue, weather wished to participate. Howl glanced at Sophie as captains glance at compasses, not for permission, for truth. Time to go, he said, not to the room, but to the story. You'll make a mess, Suleiman observed, almost affectionately. We always clean, Sophie answered, and that, I think, was where I learned bravery does not shout. It tidies. We left without breaking anything vital. That is the art. Red opened the castle, admitting us like a mother who has decided that scolding will wait until soup. Calcifer blew up the chimney in relief. Howl touched the black notch lightly, as if promising it the courtesy of not being needed. Sophie shut the door with the finality of a woman who knows the difference between exits and escapes. I exhaled a small prayer stamped with the image of a broom. Afterward, the castle rearranged itself. Doors that had been certain of their angles discovered curiosity. Shelves negotiated new neighbours. We moved the table to a patch of light where forgiveness works faster. Howl paced instruments of worry, our particular, and then, to our surprise, began to fix things no one had required him to fix. A hinge that sighed, a latch that sulked, a leak that had intended to become a personality. He worked with tenderness, the way some men sing. Sophie baked, which is to say she decided the house would smell like answers. Bread rose. Calcifer forgot to complain. I, chastened by palace ceilings and public mirrors, polished labels until jars remembered their names. We may have to walk farther, Howl said, adjusting the dial as if composing. Then, let's pack tea, Sophie said. This is what logistics looks like when run by people in love. Turnip Head resumed his patrol outside, faithful and damp. I tied a ribbon at his neck to concede our shared absurdity. He bowed until his stick creaked. I told him not to be dramatic on my account. The geranium added a flower, as if applying to be our heraldry. The kettle practiced discretion and whistled only when asked. But we still wonder whether a household can withstand a weather made of men, whether refusing a leash invites a different chain, whether hearts kept in unusual places are safer or only harder to reach when mending must be done. The door, patient teacher, offered no opinion. It simply shone where our hands had touched it most. 3 reliefs from the Republic of Daily. First, I learned to skim soup with the edge of a wooden spoon so the broth looks like good intentions. Second, Howl mended the hem of Sophie's shawl with a charm that insisted on humility and succeeded. Third, Calcifer admitted the tea tasted almost like confidence, and we pretended not to hear him be kind. Night folded us. The castle, grateful for the day's decisions, practiced being still. In my alcove, I copied a new entry into my spells notebook. A charm for staying together that requires only hot water, a clean table, and the promise to listen. Sophie slept with the steadiness of someone who had climbed an honest staircase. Howl lay down with his boots aligned like sentences come to their period. Calcifer drowsed, blue and thoughtful, guarding a secret we would one day set carefully on a plate like bread. Morning would open green or blue or red. Black would wait, as doors do, for wisdom. We would sweep, label, mend, and keep our courage where we could reach it. If the palace called again, we would answer with tea first. Some negotiations require warm cups. Moving day in a walking castle begins with an argument about dignity between the stovepipe and the wind. Calcifer insists the flue should keep its posture. The wind insists on rehearsal. I play translator, which in our house means I hold the kettle at a respectful angle and let both sides admire their reflections. Howl has decided we will reconfigure, a verb that sounds like carpentry with better hair. Sophie ties back her sleeves, which is the same as a general drawing up a plan, and I fetch the toolbox we keep for occasions when magic ought to remember it. Learned from hinges first. How many colours does a door need to feel safe? Howl asks no one, setting the brass handle on a folded towel as if it were a patient. The collar gleams, green for market chipping, blue for Port Haven, red for Kingsbury, and the black notch that looks like a bruise on purpose. One more, Sophie says, calm as a measuring cup. A place that is ours because we say so. Howl smiles like weather accepting instruction. He chalks a new sigil on the jam. Calcifer grumbles about unauthorized geography, and then, seduced by the possibility of novelty, burns a brighter, bossier blue. He turns the handle to the unborn setting, and the door opens onto a field of flowers that has been practicing for us since morning. A slope combed with gold and violet, the air written with bees. It smells slightly of forgiveness. There, Howl says, the pride of a boy who has made a secret and chosen to share it. Sophie steps out, which is to say she accepts the gift without letting it believe it made her. I follow with the blanket basket because blankets are treaties between weather and bones. We sit. The castle stands behind us, breathing iron and confidence. In front, the hills make a case for God or good grasses, depending on your education. Howl lays down like a man who has been formally introduced to rest. Sophie picks 3 flowers that do not know they are lucky and tucks them into a jar later labelled for living room light. I count bees until numbers agree to be music. For a long time we do nothing. This is a craft. War cannot find you if you are not making a noise it understands. Back inside, Howl rehangs the handle. The new notch call it white, though it looks like a well-kept secret opens to our meadow again. He wires the castle's legs to a different rhythm quieter, more thoughtful steps, and swaps a corridor for a cupboard because hiding hope in practical places is an art. Sophie moves the table to where the afternoon lands. Calcifer complains, then admits the new light makes tea less melancholy. I relabel jars. It matters that courage and coriander do not stand too close on a high shelf. A dog has joined us, the same low-bellied creature from the palace, breathing like a philosophy. He chooses a corner, interviews the rug with dignity, and permits me to scratch his head when I remember to ask. He bears messages in his eyes more than his mouth. We call him nothing official, and he answers to that too. When he snores, the castle harmonizes politely. That afternoon, Sophie walks me through her inventory of grief and glue. She shows me the places a house bleeds under the sink, along the hinge, beneath the kettle's pride, and how to dress each wound. Cloth, patience, a firm word, a second try. She teaches me the spell for returning lost buttons to their purpose. Name it, she says. Ask it. Thank it. I practice on my cuff and feel the satisfaction of thread acknowledging destiny. Turnip Head presents himself at the window, damp and earnest, carrying a string of onions he has found or convinced the ditch to surrender. We hang them in the kitchen, where they behave like well-meaning neighbours. Sophie thanks him as if bows were conversations and sends him off with the dignity of an errand he invented. Howl watches the exchange with a softness he will deny and twirls a screwdriver until it forgets its shyness. We test the door. Green opens to market chipping as ever. Haberdashers in sensible rows. Letties laugh crossing the street like a bridge. We buy sugar because forgiveness cannot be baked without it, and twine because houses collect packages of consequence. Blue returns us to Port Haven, where nets tell the day's truth and gulls hold a committee about stealing it. We purchase salt and the news, ships called back, boys called forward. Red, which we avoid, paces behind the latch as if rehearsing a march. White, when we need courage, opens to the meadow where bees maintain a polite government. At dusk, Howl shows me a trick for calibrating the castle's legs. Count to 7 as you breathe, then adjust the bolt as if smoothing the forehead of a horse too proud to be stabled. See, he says, it prefers even ground, but respects conviction. I nod, as if I have always known this about buildings. Sophie seems older and younger by turns. The curse drapes her like an unloved shawl, but when she forgets to wear it while bargaining for parsley, while scolding a pan, while telling Calcifer to stop sulking because sulking is not a fuel her face, remembers its original grammar. I pretend not to notice, the way one pretends not to notice when a friend pays for lunch with a coin too dear. Calcifer notices everything and says nothing, which is almost unprecedented. A letter arrives folded like a frown. It carries a seal that has memorized the shape of expectation. Enlistment, Howl translates, eyes doing their fast mathematics. He sets it on the mantel between the geranium and the jar labelled living room light, which refuses to wilt. We could run, I say, because running is a tool if you treat it with respect. We could walk, Sophie says, which is wiser. Howl touches the white notch like a man blessing a doorframe. We could stay, he says, and he is not lying. We do all three in turns. Night brings weather that practices being unkind. The castle leans into it as a tree does, not bravely so much as competently. I heat milk and learn the patience of small bubbles, forming a treaty with the rim. Howl reads the sky for subtext. Sophie mends Turnip Head's ribbon. The dog considers the thunder and decides to nap anyway. Calcifer keeps to a lower blue, the colour of serious listening. The next morning, Kingsbury intrudes. The red notch hums like a wire remembering electricity. A courier's voice arrives before the knock, and then the papers appear. Orders, invitations, phrases that mistake urgency for virtue. Howl writes refusals that sound like lullabies for unreasonable men. Sophie bakes because bread believes in nations, but not in governments. I copy a spell for steadiness into my notebook and underline the part that requires hot water, because hot water is a politics that never lies. We take the white notch to the meadow and eat our slices in diplomacy with the bees. Howl lies on his back and practices anonymity. Sophie counts swallows. I try to whistle and make a sound like a kettle changing its mind. For 20 minutes, the world agrees to be local. When we return, the red notch has exhausted itself, making threats at a closed door. The Witch of the Waste sends weather of her own, nothing so simple as rain. Instead, an afternoon in which mirrors refuse to be accurate, and any room with 2 exits briefly believes itself a maze. Sophie straightens the table, and the room remembers its purpose. Howl opens a window and insults a cloud with such education that it chooses to drift elsewhere. Calcifer eats an unhelpful draught and burps smoke rings to entertain my dignity. I write, Kitchen 1 Mischief 0. We visit Letty by the green setting. She smuggles us kindness wrapped as buns and news wrapped as jokes. Hearts do their best work indoors, she tells Sophie, meaning perhaps both the organ and the home. Sophie touches her sister's cheek the way one checks a compass, not doubt, alignment. On the way back, a child waves at the castle, and the castle, please believe, me waves back with a tilt of its shadow. Buildings learn manners if you keep company with them long enough. But we still wonder whether a door can keep out a weather that has memorized our names, whether secret meadows are strong enough to teach a nation to sit down, whether refusing to be cruel makes a difference to anything but the mirror. I keep these questions on a low shelf where I can reach them without knocking over the sugar. 2 small intervals for relief. First, I ruin an omelette by optimism, and then coax it into a respectable scramble with humility. Howl calls it philosophical eggs, and we agree to eat our lesson. Second, Sophie shows me how to steam a scarf over the kettle until it remembers to be gentle. We wear our warmed cloths to the door and inspect the sky like inspectors of mercy. Evenings now, the castle practices the long breath of creatures that intend to survive without becoming smaller. Calcifer drowses in content blue. The dog dreams of procedural rabbits. Turnip Head stands vigil and, when the wind tries to bully him, bows in ways that turn concession into style. Howl tunes the handle's collars with a listening face. Sophie writes 3 lines on a scrap and tucks it behind the spice jars. Be kind. Be steady. Boil water. I lie in my alcove and rewrite the day. Flowers in a jar a hinge that forgave us, letters that called themselves necessary, refusals that refused to be rude, a field that let us borrow its peace, a kitchen that chose to glow, a door that learned a fifth truth. Tomorrow we will open green or blue, perhaps red if diplomacy insists, white if we have earned it. Black waits, but black can wait. We will sweep, mend, label, listen. We will pour tea before we answer anything that calls itself war. The black notch had been a rumour in metal present, patient, seldom touched. I kept my rule the way a sailor keeps a superstition, not because I fear the sea, but because I respect it. Then came the evening when the wind went quiet too suddenly, and the geranium, which never indulges in drama, turned its face toward the door as if listening. Calcifer's blue thinned to a thinking thread. Howl stood with his hand hovering an inch from black. Sophie, who has made a habit of saying yes to the necessary, said it for us. "Open it," she told him, in the tone you use when you have already cooked for tomorrow. Black did not open to weather. It opened to before. It was night, though light behaved as if it remembered a morning not yet born. A field stretched out sparsely, the kind that keeps its secrets low to the ground. Far off, a boy ran thin, sure-footed, hair untidy, in a way I recognized without wanting to. He carried nothing but the kind of stubbornness you cannot fold into a pocket. Overhead, something fell. Not a star the way songs boast, no, a starlet of fire, small, terrified, new to gravity, shedding sparks the way frightened creatures shed pride. The boy cupped both hands and caught it. "Don't go out," he said just that, in a voice that had not learned command, only plea. The star flickered like a yes trying to be brave. Sophie took a step toward them as if history could be corrected by kindness. The field did not permit interference. Black doors are honest like that. We watched as the boy Howl, if names have the right to hold their owners across time, gave part of himself, not ceremony, transaction. He offered the star a place to burn. A contract arrived in a breath. Something bright without a body. Something human without a home. If you have ever seen a promise take shape, you know it makes a sound like a not choosing. Calcifer, in our grate, made a small, involuntary sound, the kind fire makes when it recognizes its biography. The door shut as gently as it had opened. We stood in the kitchen, we knew the geranium embarrassed to have stared, the table relieved to be table again. Sophie braced herself against the wood, as if her spine and the doorframe had agreed to share the work. "All right," she said to no one and to everything. So now we set the tea. I have never loved anyone by watching them pour tea the way Sophie poured then. Steady, practical, a little stern with the kettle for having thoughts. Howl looked at his hands as if they were letters he had received when the post was not kind. Calcifer glowed without boasting, a tender blue kid's use for drawing sky. I put out cups with the correctness of a clerk signing a treaty. There are afternoons when a household keeps its courage by boiling water. Later, when the cups had agreed to be empty, Calcifer spoke without his usual disguises. He asked me not to go out, he said, and I asked him not to go alone. Fire does not do confession easily. We treated the sentence like a newborn and did not stare. Howl, who takes compliments badly, and rescue even worse changed the subject by repairing a cupboard hinge with such gentleness the hinge forgave squeaking as a life practice. Sophie mended her shawl's edge in a spiral that would impress the moon. We did not tell the door it had been brave. Doors dislike flattery. But Howl touched the black notch with 2 fingers, the way one thanks a friend whose help must remain between you. He reset the collar to white and opened on the meadow, until all of us, house, heart, star, remembered that bees have governments and flowers make excellent witnesses because they never testify, only bloom. The days that followed learned a different rhythm. Howl's vanities became more like jokes he told on himself. Calcifer, when I fed him, stole fewer sparks and more glances. Sophie unfolded strength from her pockets the way some women unfold handkerchiefs automatically, with the authority of habit. I found myself labelling jars with a heavier hand, as if names could shoulder weight on behalf of what they contained. Courage, I wrote, and stuck the label on the inside of a cupboard door where only we would see it. Restraint went on the flour tin, mercy on the broom. News arrived whether or not we invited it. Paper birds, Suleiman's precise spies, fluttered at our windows on dry days, tapping in patterns that were almost polite. Sophie took to facing them with a saucepan lid, her expression amused and maternal. "We are busy," she told bureaucracy's feathers. "Come back when you're cooked." They swiveled their paper heads, considered the authority of apron strings, and declined to enter. I added lid to the list of protective charms in my notebook. Kingsbury continued to send envelopes that used verbs as trumpets. Howl replied with nouns that refused to be drafted. Kitchen, meadow, hinge, heart. "We are not refusing everything," he told the air. "We are choosing something." The air, which respects accurate grammar, did not argue. Madame Suleiman sent a second dog, this one so correct it seemed to have been issued with a seal. The 2 dogs assessed each other and agreed to a coalition. Naps synchronized, patrols shared, snoring alternated. Their treaty stabilized the rug situation near the hearth. One morning the Witch of the Waste stood, smaller now, the stairs had taught her bone, on our hill, and requested the courtesy of a chair. Sophie brought one and set it in shade. The witch sat with the composure of a woman who has purchased many mirrors and is learning windows. "You have his heart somewhere inconvenient," she observed to Howl, as if complimenting an eccentric interior design choice. Howl, to his credit, did not lie. "I have his friendship," Sophie said for him, and the 3 of them— Witch, wizard, woman let the afternoon learn that word's shape. Turnip Head bowed to the witch until his stick ribs considered unionizing. She ignored him as only the once glamorous can ignore earnestness. Calcifer refused to sputter. I prepared lemonade that tasted of forgiveness, served it in chipped cups that have seen too many truths to break over new ones, and thought a treasonous thought for an apprentice, that villains are often tired, and tired people can sometimes be negotiated with by blankets and decent drinks. But we still wonder whether knowing the origin of a contract makes it easier to honour or harder to bear, whether love that includes maintenance and mending can stand up to winds that prefer spectacle, whether a heart kept in unusual places learns unusual ways to return home. 3 light assignments from the Republic of Ordinary to ease the chest. First, I over-whipped cream into an attitude, Sophie folded in milk and praise until it remembered dessert. Second, the kettle began to whistle before boiling, a precocious habit. Howl tapped the lid and gave it a sentence about patience that would calm a thunderhead. Third, I patched my own sleeve with thread the exact blue of that night's Calcifer, and felt a small, honest pride travel the seam like a polite river. We took the white notch to the meadow when the walls needed new air. Howl lay back, eyes half closed, and practiced looking like a man without appointments. Sophie counted swallows out loud to make the sky keep time. I asked Calcifer, tucked in a grate we had carried like a lantern, whether stars ever regret falling. Only when no one is there to catch, he said. Catch does not always mean hands. I wrote that down under advice received from elements. Not all was honey and thoughtfulness. A day came smelling of metal and memory when Porthaven sent up a smudge on the horizon that was the colour of interruption. We did not go to watch. We went to fetch. Buckets, blankets, bandages, bread. Sophie set the table for whoever would need a place to sit and remember their names. Howl took the blue notch, came back with 2 fishermen whose nets had learned to be ropes, set them by the fire, and apologized to their boots for the long walk. We cleaned smoke from hair with steam and patience. We spoke to them about boats and weather instead of about loss, because grief likes to keep its own calendar. They slept with their hands still curved as if holding oars. In the morning they ate quietly, said thank you like men paying an honest bill, and walked out stronger than they had arrived. I do not romanticize such nights. I stack plates, I sweep, I write, we kept the kettle full. After, our castle learned a new stillness, not silence stillness, a readiness that is the opposite of flinching. Howl tuned the legs to step softer over hill shadow. Sophie set an extra cup on the shelf where we keep spare. Calcifer held steady like a candle in a chapel with practical liturgy. I oiled the door hinges because doors doing their work without complaint is a civic good. Sophie and I had a quiet conversation by the sink where the geranium oversees diplomacy. You saw it, I said, meaning the boy, the star, the trade. She nodded. Then you know why he hides and why he can't. She handed me a towel as if to include me in the policy. Courage, she said, is chores performed in the open. I dried the cup as if it were a plan. Night fell like a curtain sewn by someone who prefers neat hems. In my alcove, I copied a charm titled For Keeping What Matters Warm Without Burning It. Ingredients: water that has forgiven the pot, a table wiped in circles, a door polished with sleeves, 3 breaths counted out loud, a promise made small enough to keep daily. I underlined the instruction to open the white notch once a day, if possible. In the grate, Calcifer drowsed, watchful. On the bricks, 2 dogs arranged themselves like punctuation that knows when to end a sentence. Turnip Head stood facing east, because some loyalty is a sunrise posture. Sophie slept with her hand relaxed on the edge of a basket of mending, as if to argue that even dreams should be reachable. Howl lay very still in a way that suggests someone is practicing not to leave when the wind calls. In the morning we would have markets to visit, a letter to refuse without meanness, a shawl edge to finish, a hinge that would thank oil by keeping its promises, perhaps a traveller to feed, surely a rumour to salt properly before swallowing. The door would open to green and blue, red if diplomacy required a clean shirt, white if our pulse needed bees. Black would wait until courage and kindness could walk through it together without startling the past. The morning after the fisherman left, the castle woke with that particular calm a house wears when it has done the right work. Even the broom had better posture. Sophie brewed tea that tasted like decisions reached without witnesses. Howl tuned the legs to a slower, cadenceless parade, more amble, and whistled under his breath, as if telling the screws their courage was noticed. Calcifer hummed a low vowel, the hearth's version of a nod. I sharpened my pencil, which is how apprentices bow to a day. Letters arrived, as they do, by couriers who never use doors, and by birds that know where windows are friendliest. One on cream paper that refused to wrinkle came from Letty. She had written around a grease spot, as if the stain were a cousin rather than an offence. Sophie, I'm well. The bakery rises at dawn and refuses to stop. Take care where shadows pretend to be corridors. And if the scarecrow bows too low, offer him a ribbon. She drew a small loaf with steam that resembled a heart. Sophie smiled in that way that makes rooms decide to be kinder and tuck the letter into the bread tin. We'll rise too, she told it, and the kettle, flattered, hurried. We needed flour, thread, and the ordinary courage of markets. Green opened, and market chipping organized itself into polite errands. News moved through the stalls in the careful voice people use when truth is heavy. Words like drafts, searchlights, postponed. Sophie bought onions because soup listens, and yarn because blankets are politics in winter. A hat in the shop window winked at her with the memory of an old life. She winked back, which is to say she forgave and continued. I carried the sack with that theatrical sturdiness boys perform for approval. She patted my sleeve as if I had lifted something larger. On the way home we met Turnip Head, damp with purpose, saluting a hedge. Sophie retied his ribbon, this time with a square knot she said would outlast a wind's argument. Thank you, I told him, because one should always thank those who keep watch even when they are made of sticks. He bobbed and nearly unmade himself with gratitude. The castle, seeing him, produced the smallest creak of welcome. I swear it did. Red hummed when we passed the door, sulking at not being chosen. Howl lifted the collar one notch and listened to the hinge the way a doctor listens to a lung. Not today, he told Kingsbury, kindly, as one declines a second slice when the first is still being digested. He turned to White, and the meadow received us with bees spelling civility on the air. We ate onions raw with bread and called it a plan. Sophie tucked 2 flowers into the jar on the mantel. Howl lay on his back and practiced indifference to clouds. I tried to whistle and produced something between a kettle and a polite bird. For 20 minutes the world forgot the vocabulary for urgency. Back in the kitchen, I found Madame Suliman's second dog asleep on the rug, snoring in bureaucratic rhythms. Our first dog adjusted his breathing to harmonize. Treaties should always be this elegant. The dogs had carried messages in their fur-faint traces of lavender and ink, and Sophie brushed them out with a care reserved for documents. "Tell your mistress," she informed their ears, "that our cups are clean and our refusals are kind." They thumped approval in Morse. Calcifer watched us, mischief banked. "If a house is a spell, who cast it?" he asked Sophie, not quite a taunt, more like a riddle he hoped we would answer on his behalf. Sophie wiped her hands on her apron and looked at the grate, the way one looks at a friend who has hidden a letter behind his back. "The ones who live in it," she said, "and the ones who keep their promises. Fire, when it considers tears, crackles instead. He did that." In the afternoon, Porthaven called through blue. We opened, intending only salt air and the consent of gulls, and found the town practicing resilience. Sails mended on land, nets braided tighter than prayer, women laughing with their hands to keep them steady. Howl stood a little apart and faced the line where sea negotiates sky. He does not grandstand when the horizon is working. He whispered something I didn't hear, and the wind, generous, pretended to be deaf, so the wish would not be shy. We brought back fish, the kind that prefer hot pans and modest recipes. Sophie salted them with authority and told Calcifer to behave. He behaved. Howl swept the stoop, which is to say he said sorry to our doorstep for boot prints he had not meant and whistled a tune that soothed hinges. I set the table and counted plates twice, because counting is my spell for don't break. Then came the knock. That wasn't a knock, the room cooling by a degree, the door's brass going thoughtful, the dogs lifting their heads in synchronized caution. Howl set down the broom, Sophie wiped her hands. I reached for the drawer where we keep spare courage disguised as string. The handle turned to red by itself. Only a hair, only enough for a sentence to step through. The Crown requests. Not a voice, exactly. A habit of rooms with uniforms. Howl smiled the way thunder does when it agrees to be polite. "Tell the Crown we are currently occupied by soup," he said, and shut the notch with 2 fingers. The soup thanked him by improving. I wish all intrusions could be managed with broth. That evening, however, paper birds returned, beaks tapping out an alphabet of urgency. Sophie lifted the lid she had adopted as shield. "Eat your instructions elsewhere," she told them. They probed for gaps. The house supplied none. Howl raised an eyebrow, and the castle adjusted a seam in the doorway, the architectural equivalent of clearing one's throat. The birds withdrew, offended yet impressed. Calcifer burped smoke rings as a gesture of détente. Night fell with an attitude. I copied into my notebook a charm titled "For a Kitchen That Refuses Panic." Clean the table, set 3 cups, light the fire with yesterday's gratitude, speak the names of things by their right names, touch the door and remember you chose it. Sophie read Letty's letter again and laughed at the part about shadows acting like corridors. "We will not be lost," she said. The laugh did more than any spell I know. Sometime near midnight, Howl sat at the table and took off his rings. He lined them like planets learning a simpler orbit. "Calcifer," he said, "what would you do if I asked you to be only fire?" It was not a challenge. It was the sort of question men ask when they are preparing to keep their part of an old bargain. Calcifer hissed theatrically and then sobered. "I would try." Sophie looked from one to the other as if measuring cloth. "We will all try," she said. No one picked up a wand. The work had already begun. The next day, Sophie's curse behaved with unusual rudeness. age pressed heavier, the stick asked her to lean more honestly. She did not plead. She scrubbed a pan with such exactness that the metal remembered youth. Spells, she told me, lose their footing when you give them chores. Howl watched her, as if learning a language he had mocked and now wanted to speak correctly. He offered her a seat. She declined it with a smile, and then, a minute later, took it. That is how proud people keep each other safe. A letter came from Kingsbury with the tone of a citizen inspecting a pantry. It named Madame Suleiman as interim to matters we would prefer not to be named. It suggested compulsory service. It did not say please. Howl read it, folded it, and placed it under the leg of a wobbly chair. The chair steadied. At last, a use, he said. Sophie laughed into her sleeve. I added the episode to my doctrine. Literature and order's excellent shims. But we still wonder whether kindness can hold when orders lean, whether hearts kept in inconvenient locations can be reached quickly when the world knocks without waiting, whether a door with 5 settings can be enough for a country inventing new winds. I wondered aloud once, drying the last cup. Sophie set it on the shelf and said, "We answer the door with clean hands." It is either the simplest policy or the bravest. 3 light proofs from the Republic of Ordinary to remind the day what it's for. First, I taught the dogs to wait before eating, and they taught me patience by returning the favour. Second, Turnip Head delivered a dropped glove to a traveller and bowed so convincingly the man forgot to be surprised and remembered to be grateful. Third, the geranium added 2 blooms. I moved it to the sunnier sill and whispered, "You're doing beautifully," which made me ridiculous and correct. Evening poured itself into our rooms. Howl tuned the handle as if it were a harp. Sophie wrote a short list: flour, pepper, thread, courage, and tucked it under the sugar, because sweetness often hides the heaviest work. Calcifer banked his flame into the shade. I have learned to call keeping oath. I lay in my alcove and copied a new charm for unravelling a knot, without humiliating the rope, and fell asleep before I could test it. In the quiet, just before sleep loosens its grip, I felt the castle breathe. Not the breath of fear, the breath of something deciding to carry on. Outside, the meadow held our secret carefully. In town, a baker set dough to rise. Somewhere, paper birds argued about lids. On the hill, a scarecrow faced east, because east is where hope practices. In the grate, a star kept its promise. In the next room, a woman slept with her hand near a pile of mending as if to remind destiny she had a needle. And a wizard, who has been called heartless and necessary in the same week, lay still long enough for the room to learn the shape of his kindness. Morning would come with errands and maybe insistences. The handle would choose green or blue, perhaps red if diplomacy required civility. White if bees were needed for sentence structure. Black would wait until we could open it without flinching. We would sweep. We would label. We would feed whoever arrived hungry. We would boil water first. The day arrived polite and wrong, like a letter sealed with someone else's wax. The dogs woke first own ear each, lifted in a shared punctuation, then Calcifer, whose blue thinned to a wire and held. Weather, he warned, but he meant the sort that wears boots. Howl adjusted the handle with his listening fingers, Red hummed as if a room far away had cleared its throat. Sophie folded her apron with the care of a soldier putting away a flag, and said what we were already thinking. "We'll go tidy what we can." Kingsbury is always composed, but that morning it had the shine of a table set for an argument. Madame Suliman received us in a courtyard, where fountains repeated good sense and mirrors waited to be honest. She wore the expression of a woman who knows how to file mercy, and still prefers not to. The Witch of the Waste had been invited too, carried in on a chair, not because she demanded it, but because stairs had become a confession. Beside Suliman sat the dog we called Official, Tail approving of policy on principle. "There will be no theatrics," Suliman announced, which is what people say before a lesson hires a spotlight. She gestured, and the air simplified. Glamours fell away. The witch's borrowed beauty drifted like ash, leaving a formidable smallness. The dog at Suliman's heel blinked and became a gentleman under an enchantment so tidy it might have been designed by furniture. Even the courtyard admitted it was only a room that had learned to behave outdoors. "We are reducing the world to what it can carry," Suliman said, not unkindly. "What remains must be strong." Sophie stood straighter in her grandmother shape. "Strong is not the same as cruel," she replied, and the mirrors, being fair, reflected agreement in the light. Suliman nodded as one acknowledges the right phrase. "Your wizard," she told Sophie, "likes to keep his heart where paperwork can't find it." She looked at me then, with the accuracy of a librarian who knows exactly what is misshelved. "You know this. I remembered the black door, the boy in the field, the falling star, and kept my mouth the right size for secrets." Demonstrations began. Suliman lifted a hand, and a storm assembled politely over the palace lake, then unassembled at her second thought. She drew a line on the floor, and it became a path between two safe towns, then rubbed it out so swiftly the distance sighed. "This is what obedience can do," she said. "It can move harm without waking it." The witch, reduced to hunger-stripped of glamour, watched like a woman listening through a closed door to a party she once hosted. Sophie said nothing. She sorted the room with her eyes the way she sorts drawers what is worth keeping, what must be washed, what can be thrown away without losing history. And then, because stories are punctual even when people aren't, the sky changed key. Not theatrics, just a steady darkening, as if noon had put on a thinking cloak. In that sober light, Howl arrived the way straightforward weather arrives, not to be admired, only to be correctly named. He looked at Suliman and at Sophie and at the small, stubborn remainder of the witch, and he did the arithmetic every good housekeeper does without boasting. What is fragile? What is flammable? What can still be saved? "Madame," he said, courteous as a bow that refuses to kneel, "I have brought bad habits and good intentions. Kindly keep whichever is easier to store." Suliman's mouth almost remembered laughter. Then duty reclaimed the chair. "I need a promise," she said. "Refuse if you like, but refuse honestly." Howl glanced at Sophie, the way captains glance at shore. "I promise," he said, "to keep my house harmless." It was not the state's promise, it was ours. We left with fewer illusions in the wagon than we had brought. The witch came too not caged, only out of ideas, and willing to audit our warmth. On the hill, The castle turned its face toward us with that mechanical relief I think of as friendship. Calcifer, careful, Blue took one look at the witch and did not sputter. "We're practicing kindness," he said, "which for fire is a high ceremony." What followed was housekeeping under pressure. Howl tuned the legs to step softer but farther. Sophie rearranged rooms by the moral logic of blankets. Whoever is coldest gets the next fold. The witch, now mostly appetite and memory, wandered our corridors, touching objects as if they used to know her. I watched her hands and learned where to put breakables out of both reach and shame. Then came the afternoon when Red rattled the handle like a messenger who has mistaken insistence for necessity. Letters stacked themselves on the mat words such as levy, oath, service, and we stacked them under the short chair again. "Furniture," Howl said, "should carry the state, not the other way round." Sophie baked a loaf the shape of resistance and sliced it thin to stretch courage. I stirred soup and pretended not to count ladles the way a clerk counts days. By evening, the castle had the expression of a creature bracing to shed a skin. Howl stood by the black notch with that gentleness he saves for dangerous tools. Sophie, who never refuses a necessary mess, touched the doorframe. "We will open it," she told the house, but only to fetch what love dropped. I held my breath as if it were a pot I did not want to boil over. Calcifer narrowed to a flame that had remembered night in a field. Black again, and before again only nearer, and this time the door did not mind interference. We saw the moment when the boy offered the star a room. "Don't go out," he whispered, and the star knew to grammar answered with burning. We saw the boy's chest accept the guest it was too small for, which is how bravery always begins, and we saw the thread that would later play itself as a contract in our kitchen. Sophie stepped forward with the authority of someone who has mended 100 cuffs and does not doubt the next one will consent. "Thank you," she told that night, and the thank you travelled through time, through bargains, through our door back to our grate where Calcifer brightened briefly without smoke. When the door shut, Howl had tears he did not dramatize. "We have work," he said, using the only cure he likes. And we did. The witch, drawn by the scent of a heart like a child to jam, drifted toward Calcifer with a careful greed. "No," Sophie said, not cruel, not loud. A broom sentence that escorts dust back to appropriate corners. The witch, surprised by being stopped with dignity, sat down. "I was beautiful," she murmured, and Sophie, who knows about surfaces and labor, answered, "You were busy." That night, decisions grew into shapes. Howl unpinned mirrors from his walls and hung them where the house needed eyes. He drew on the hearthstone a neat circle and labelled it, because labels are spells, stay. He asked Calcifer if he could be only fire for a while, and Calcifer, proud of how far he had come in the business of restraint, said, "If you are only human for a while." It was a trade spoken like a joke and accepted like a vow. We moved. Not the walk, we practiced daily a reconfiguration that required unbuilding as much as building. Howl dismantled the heavy top room that frightened winds love to bully. He built us a low, stubborn profile like a boat that respects chop. Sophie cannibalized a cupboard into a cradle for the witch's tiredness and set it near the hearth, where even malice learns to nap. I mapped our jars to new shelves with the empires of salt and sugar kept prudently apart. White opened to the meadow when we needed to remember a nation made of bees. Green opened to market chipping for flour and the news that women had found ways to refuse loudly without being rude. Blue gave us Porthaven when we wanted to send fish back into soup bowls that had recently been empty. Red was allowed a crack only to read the sky's posture. Black remained a tool wrapped in cloth. On the second morning post-move, a bomb fell somewhere not near, and we felt the day wince. We made tea. A messenger bird banged itself against our window. Sophie opened it and fed the bird crumbs, and then the truth. We are not forgetting you. It stopped trying to get in and perched on the sill instead, which is what grief does when it is treated humanely. Howl went out, he has skies he answers to, but he went without his usual pursuit of admiration, and returned without injuries he could make into stories. He simply set his boots by the door, side by side, like a man grateful to report to a flaw. I nudged some winds, he said. I persuaded a flame to lose interest in roofs. Sophie kissed his hair the way one blesses bread before slicing. I pretended to be busy with knives. But we still wonder whether promises made in kitchens can keep roofs honest when the sky forgets its manners. Whether a heart returned to its rightful place will remember how to do its old job without complaint. Whether the better story, the one we tell with soup and civility, can outlast the louder one that prefers drums. 3 small mercies from the Republic of Ordinary. First, I scorched porridge. Sophie saved it with milk and forgiveness, and called it toasty, which is diplomacy worth studying. Second, the dogs learned to take turns choosing nap spots. Peace accords often look like that. Third, the geranium, which had no obligation to participate in our courage, produced a flower so red it made the room remember joy as a policy. By evening, the castle had settled into its new gate lower, steadier, almost modest. Calcifer, tired from pretending to be smaller, banked to a tender ember the colour of promises that will be kept tomorrow. The witch slept, hands open like someone who has put down her last argument. Howl adjusted the handle's collars with the attention of a musician. Tuning strings he will not break tonight. Sophie wrote a list on brown paper. Tea, thread, lemons for kindness, resolve for everything. She tucked the list under the sugar because sweetness should guard what is difficult. In my alcove, I copied a charm titled "For Houses That Choose Not to Be Brave But Are Anyway." Ingredients: 1 door polished by many hands, 1 flame that can keep a secret, 3 cups that remember who held them last, a meadow visited whenever the grammar of the day collapses, a promise to open black only when love and work ask together. I underlined, boil water first, morning would come, green would be market, blue would be salt, red would be a posture, white would be bees, black would be a history we can now touch without lying. We would sweep and mend and label and listen. We would refuse cruelty with hot soup. We would keep the door unlocked for the kind and the lost. And if the crown knocked, we would answer with clean hands. The new gate held for 3 days the way a house keeps a promise, by learning a different breath. We adjusted with the respect owed to a living contraption. I learned where the floor rose with intention, where a cup might drift if the hill argued, where the cupboard preferred to listen to the wind. Sophie, who never wastes instruction, set the broom to a path that taught the feet of the furniture their manners. Howl tuned the legs each morning as if they were strings. Calcifer consented to a steady blue that meant holding. Letty's letter came again flower on the corner like punctuation telling us. Market Chipping had decided to share courage in pies, which is how small towns survive large nouns. We pinned the note near the sugar. We'll bake after mending, Sophie said, and Calcifer grudgingly admitted he was in a pastry mood. The dogs napped, one eye each, setting an example for diplomats. Turnip Head stood to the east and absorbed patience by osmosis. Then the air brought visitors with tidy boots. Not soldiers, not exactly. Suleiman's politeness travels in people who look like corridors learn to walk. They did not knock. The brass cooled in warning. Paper birds pecked a rhythm that sounded like policy. A tidy cloud off to the south went thoughtful in a way that buildings dislike. The handle trembled, and not from us. Howl moved first, with the gentleness he saves for dangerous tools and difficult mornings. He set the collar to white and opened upon the meadow as if naming a refuge aloud would make it braver. Sophie, he said, and held out the ring he sometimes wears for theatre, and sometimes for reasons he will not discuss. If you need a place I cannot carry to you, this will carry you to it. The stone flickered no colour a jeweller would respect, only the colour of intention. Sophie slid it on with the practicality of someone fastening an apron. The knock that was not a knock arrived ere bending its knees. A voice without throat described the virtues of compliance. The witch, softened lately by blankets and tea, stirred. Old appetites remember invitations even when they're written in ink they can no longer read. No, Sophie said, and the word behaved like a broom set smartly across a threshold. We have soup. Come back when you're hungry for that. We did not get to choose quite so beautifully. The castle shuddered. A seam we had recently persuaded to be polite decided to remember earthquakes. The floor tipped, not cruelly, simply busy. I caught the jar labelled living room light and tucked it under my arm like a child. Calcifer tightened into a hard, competent flame. Take me out, he said to Sophie, which sounds like romance and is really engineering. She fetched the hearth pan we keep for occasions when fire must be moved without melodrama, and he leapt into it with a sound like a yes, bearing weight. The house, robbed of its heart's convenience, groaned and let a wall become a door where no door had applied for the job. We went outside because inside had terms we could not negotiate. Wind ran its hands through our hair without asking. The castle shed pieces the way a tree sheds barkuntity, but necessary. Howl stood in the doorway that had decided to be a mouth and judged a dozen tasks at once. Which plank to bless, which bolt to promise, which wall to teach self-respect. He looked older then, not by years, but by decisions made accurately under speed. Go with her, he told Menno Thunder. Only Grammaran then, to Sophie, keep the fire. I'll fetch the roof. Sophie moved with the steadiness of a woman who knows the cost of unhurried hands. She set Calcifer down on a flat stone. Don't go out, she told him, meaning more than flame, and he answered, don't go alone, meaning more than walking. The ring warmed. Water, Sophie said, and I ran to the stream, because here, at least, the world still remembered how to be simple. Cups, bread, a shawl repurposed as dignity. Housekeeping is sometimes triage wearing an apron. The witch woke fully and reached for the pan, the way old citizens reach for old laws. No, Sophie said again, not scolding, not cruel. This belongs where it keeps us. The witch met her eyes, and stranger than any glamour abide. I saw then the first mercy that finishing grants to those who have been mighty, to be given a job at last that requires no costume. Sit, Sophie told her. Guard this tea. She did. Behind us, the castle decided it would rather be smaller than broken. It collapsed with grace, settling its rooms into a platform and a door, legs retracting like a creature remembering a childhood trick. Howl arrived out of weather, a little singed, not proud of it. He had gathered what roofs could be persuaded and allowed what could not to become tomorrow's regret. He looked at us, the pan, the witch in charge of tea, the two dogs performing committee, and smiled with the kind of tired that respects chairs. There, he said, as if he had merely tidied a shelf. We reassembled improvised castle. A door, two rails, a platform, with the stub of a room clinging to it, like a child, who, despite fear, agrees to try. Calcifer returned to the grate we held like an open book. The flame took his place with a sigh that sounded a little like thanks. The ring glowed on Sophie's hand, and when she turned it, a thread of light ran forward across the air. Follow, it advised, and the advice had the gravity of the obvious. I'll go, Sophie said. I'll go with you, I said. You'll come back, Howl said, which is better than permission. The light led us through scrub and polite stones, then down, then briefly not pain, not fear through black again, but tuned now to after instead of before. We came to a place where time had been generous once and was willing to be again. The memory of a field, the sound of a boy saying, "Don't go out," the warmth of a star learning a language, the ring's light threaded forward like a needle that understands sleeves. We passed it into a room that existed only because someone had wanted to keep breathing. At the centre, hidden so cleverly the hiding had become habit, lay what should never have had to travel so far. A heart, sleeping like a bird that trusts the branch. I will not make a hymn of the next moment. Sophie reached, the witch who had followed in her quiet way, the tea guard done. The appetite remembering love reached too. Greed and care touched the same thing. Let go, Sophie told her, with a courtesy that forgives without forgetting. The witch let go. That is the sort of victory people forget to celebrate. We will not. We brought the heart. We brought it without ceremony, because ceremony would have made it shy. Back on the platform, Howl lay as still as a person can when he is doing more than one honest thing at once. Sophie knelt, the ring's light steady as breath, and without a speech, because speeches are sometimes thieves, gave it back. The world made a small, precise sound, like a knot choosing to untie itself. Calcifer burstenly for a blinkin to the kind of blue that remembers nights on hills. Then he settled, intensely himself and newly free. Howl's eyes opened and learned the room. You came back, he observed, which is our household's most extravagant praise. Turnip Head chose that moment to hop into his truth. Sophie kissed his wooden face, the way one thanks a messenger for enduring weather. The Scarecrow became a young man all at once whole, startled, courtly, claiming a name that belonged to a prince from a country our red notch only sometimes acknowledges. He laughed like a person who had sat too long in a story and was pleased to stand. "I am rescued by a kiss," he said, a little astonished at the old fairness of that rule. Sophie, who had performed the arithmetic and found it kind, nodded. "Go rescue your country," she told him. "We have dishes. We did have dishes. We also had a house, now lightened by a contract completed, and a heart returned to its proper shelf. Howl stood and did not lie about being tired. The witch slept with her hands open like a child who has been forgiven for arriving late to gentleness. Calcifer spun a small ring of sparks in celebration, and then extinguished it himself, proud of his new restraint. The dogs rearranged themselves to spell the word home in a language only Flaws read. But we still wonder whether returning a heart teaches it better habits than losing it ever did. Whether a friendship survives becoming only itself. Whether a castle, having learned to be small without being afraid, will remember not to practice bigness just because bigness is available. We wonder this while drying plates with care enough to qualify as faith. To ease the air, 3 small civilian proofs. First, I baked a pie with Letty's ratios more fruit than bravery, less sugar than nostalgia, and it held. Sophie called it honest. Second, Howl mended a child's toy we found near the hedge with a spell that required only patience. He returned it anonymously and looked as if his coat had become lighter. Third, the geranium, which had watched heart logistics without ever fainting, offered a new leaf the colour of forgiveness. Evening learned us again. The platform castle rocked gently in a manner agreeable to tea. The doors' collars were tuned, green for bread, blue for salt, red for diplomacy if obliged, white for bees, black wrapped in cloth for history, visited only to remind gratitude how to speak. Sophie wrote a short list and a long word after, and tucked both under the sugar. Calcifer dozed at the edge of flame, uncontracted and utterly employed. Howl placed his hand briefly, without drama, over the place where hearts are usually kept, and smiled like a man who has been returned the simplest tool. I lay in my alcove and copied a charm titled, "For Keeping a Returned Thing Gentle." Ingredients: speak softly to it, give it chores, never praise it for being dramatic, praise it for being on time. Set a place for it at the table, let it sleep near warmth. Teach it to open doors. I underlined, boil water first. Tomorrow the door would open to bakeries and nets and possibly a palace that insists. We would sweep, we would mend, we would keep refusing cruelty with cups and chores, and if the world asked for declarations, we would offer invitations to sit, to eat, to listen. The castle, smaller and truer, would walk. Morning took our measure and approved. The platform castle rocked with the poise of a boat that has stopped pretending it is a house. The rails kept their promises. The door gleamed as if sleeves were a kind of varnish. Calcifer burned the colour of work done and work left. A blue that minds its own business but notices yours. Howl stretched without theatrics and touched his chest in a gesture that was not vanity for once, only housekeeping confirming the key had returned to its cupboard. Sophie, who sleeps like a thesis once the footnotes behave, tied back her hair and made the stove understand oats. I set out bowls and counted spoons as if arithmetic could keep luck from straying. A knock arrived the honest way, with knuckles and courtesy. Turnip Head now, the prince, whose name our red setting occasionally acknowledges, stood at the threshold in a jacket that had learned diplomacy overnight. He thanked us as if gratitude were a job title. "I'll go end it," he said simply, meaning the weather made of men. He kissed Sophie's hand the way one thanks a lighthouse for existing, and bowed to Howl with a soldier's admiration for someone who keeps the sky in a good mood. "If you require carpets," Howl replied, "Kingsbury hoards them." They smiled at each other like cousins who have decided to stop competing at last. The prince left, promising to return furniture to its owners. The dogs escorted him to the hill and consented to be admired. We used the quiet he bequeathed. Howl tuned the castle again lower, steadier, with modest ambitions. He found in the jumble of salvaged rooms a pair of hinged wings that had meant to be theatrical and persuaded them to be useful instead. "We'll fly when walking is impolite," he announced, fastening bolts the way you fasten a sentence to its meaning. Sophie tested every join as if checking the seams of a winter coat. Calcifer flared once, preening at the thought of wind through feathered iron, and then settled into the competence of fuel. Sophie suggested a visit to Letieto, deliver pies and peace, and confirm that bakery windows were still rehearsing sunlight. The green notch consented, and market chipping obliged. Cobbles that prefer polished shoes, shop fronts dusted with discipline, gossip gentler than last week's. Letty flour-dusted Sophie's cheek on purpose, a sacrament among sisters, and pressed into my arms a parcel that weighed hope. Currant buns, still hot enough to argue with fingers. "How's the weather where you are?" she asked. "Mixed," I said, "with a chance of bees." She nodded, understanding that white is not a forecast, but a setting you choose. On the hill outside town, a group of children pointed at our rebuilt castle and claimed it had winked. I did not deny it. Good buildings flirt respectfully with the neighbourhoods that tolerate them. We bought thread resilience on a spool and a new brush for the hearth because Calcifer deserves bristles that forgive. At the hat shop window, Sophie looked past the glass as if checking that the girl she once was had finally gone to lunch. She did not go in. She did not need to. Later, she had said for months. Today, her shoulders pronounced now without ceremony. Back home, Howl suggested a test of the wings. Only up, he told the castle, only to remember. Calcifer consented to a brighter burn. Bolts listened. Rails leaned. We rose a careful shoulder above the hill-no-stunt. Merely a page turning gently. The meadow below kept its bees. The sky above tried on a bluer blue, as if considering promotion. Sophie laughed, not the polite kind reserved for visitors. The laugh that mends you from the inside, and held the rail with a hand that had learned to trust wood again. I gripped my hat and pretended to be unconcerned. The dogs spread their paws like philosophers, declining to comment. We settled after a minute, and the castle, pleased with its confidence, tucked its wings, like a bird that prefers sensible landings. Letters arrived with less trumpet. One from Madame Suleiman contained 3 sentences and a silence. "The prince has presented himself. Negotiations proceed. Your household is acknowledged." She had stamped acknowledged with the kind of ink that keeps rooms warm. Howl placed the note on the mantel as if accepting a medal on behalf of furniture. Sophie rolled her eyes fondly and added a flower from the jar labelled Living Room Light. The mantel looked like a small procession, letter, bloom, a tiny lighthouse I had whittled from a peg to keep our courage ornamental. The witch of the waste, now mostly grandmother with good posture, occupied a chair by the fire and taught me how to thread a needle without insulting the thread. "Do not lick it," she said. "Thread has its own pride." She watched Howl with the curiosity you give to men who have remembered to be handsome only after learning usefulness. "You've kept your heart," she mused. "Try keeping your appointments." Howl bowed from the kitchen doorway with 2 cups of tea and managed not to preen. Sophie adopted the chair opposite, and between them Eyre learned a new courtesy. "I have promised you details, and not merely weather. So let me mark them." The ring on Sophie's hand no longer burned like a map. It warmed like a stone from a pocket held during a hard walk. The door's collars sat quieter. Green for errands that improve neighbourhoods, blue for salt and apologies, red for when governments remember to ask rather than tell, white for bees and forgiveness, black wrapped in cloth and reachable only on the day the house asks for history. The geranium developed ambitions and divided its leaves as if recruiting. We gave it the better sill and pretended not to chutes. We worked at mending the way some people work at music. Howl visited roofs that had developed poor character and persuaded them not to leak. He returned boots side by side like class photographs. Sophie patched the witch's shawl with stitches neat enough to persuade envy to take up knitting. I relabelled every jar after the move, so courage and coriander did not quarrel. Calcifer learned how to simmer and not sulk. He is proud of this and believes no one has noticed. So we have not spoiled his pleasure by praising him out loud. In the afternoon, a messenger arrived from Kingsbury, lacking paper only a voice in a breath. "Ceasefire. You do not shout a word like that. You set it on the table next to the bread and let people touch it." Sophie poured tea into our best cups. Howl opened the white notch and let the breeze read the room. Calcifer, for the first time in weeks, popped a celebratory spark and caught it himself. The dogs wagged in a way that suggested democracy. We did not plan a speech. We ate currant buns, with the slow attention due to food that has waited in someone else's oven to bring you a message. We flew that evening a little, because joy is trustworthy in small portions. The castle's wings carried us over fields where scarecrows minded their business, and over a brook that had learned to gloss stones elegantly. We passed a cottage whose lamp made the shape of patience on the ground. Sophie waved. "We'll be neighbours," she said, and the sentence landed inside me like a new shelf-useful, promising level. Howl kept one hand on the rail and one on the handle, a man measuring the distance between weather and home. We settled near our meadow, and the white notch breathed out bees. But we still wonder whether hearts, once returned, will remember to keep to their chores, whether a castle that can fly will choose to walk when walking is called for, whether peace that begins in a letter on a mantel can make the rounds of kitchens before it loses its way in halls. I wonder this while I dry bowls that had the good sense to be empty when needed, and listen to the room practice the old music of enough. 3 small proofs to loosen the string the day tied around our chests. First, I attempted to explain to the dogs that biscuits are not a right but a privilege. They agreed with me entirely, and then demonstrated how privileges become customs. Second, a child on the hill shouted, "Make it wave!" and the castle, in an excess of manners, let its shadow bow. We pretended the wind had done it to keep superstition sweet. Third, the kettle sang on the exact note Howl was humming, and he looked at it as if he had been harmonized by destiny. Sophie called it practice. Night learned us, as it does. Howl unscrewed a hinge and made it quiet. Sophie wrote a lys flower, soap, laughter, and tucked it behind the sugar again, because sweetness keeps confidence best. The witch nodded off mid-instruction about needle pride. I placed the threaded one safely in the pincushion and felt like a conspirator in gentleness. Calcifer banked low, proud of behaving like a hearth instead of a meteor. I opened my notebook and copied a charm titled "For Teaching Joy" to take small bites. Brew tea, open white once, count bees, praise a hinge for silence. Put currants in everything for a week. Keep the door oiled. Before sleep, Sophie stood at the threshold and touched each colour once with the respect one pays to good alphabet. Howl came beside her and did the same, their hands polite as a duet that likes its own tune. The door shone in the places we had touched it most, which is how you know a home is learning who lives there. I lay in my alcove and rehearsed tomorrow. Green for Letty's news, blue for salt, and the gossip of nets. Red only if governments remember to bring pleas. White whenever patience needs bees. Black only when gratitude requests a visit to teach it scale. We would sweep. We would mend. We would keep refusing cruelty with cups and chores. And if anyone asked who cast the spell that made this house a promise, I would answer the way Sophie did. The ones who live here and the ones who keep. Peace, when it arrives, does not sweep. It dusts where the light lands and trusts you to finish the corners. The castle felt it first, the legs unlearning urgency, the rails relaxing their shoulders, the door brightening in the places our sleeves had polished out of habit. Calcifer settled into the strict contentment of a hearth that knows what it is for. Howl tested his breath against the morning and found it exactly long enough to carry a song to the kettle without losing the key. Sophie wrote a small list: flour, soap, string, visit Letty, and tucked it, as custom dictates, behind the sugar, which keeps confidences better than jars labelled so. News walked rather than flew. Turnip Head returned to princeliness, and politics sent word that truces had learned grammar in 3 capitals, that soldiers were discovering the right to be bored, that upholstery was being returned to chairs. Madame Suleiman wrote once 4 lines, spare as a ledger, and stamped thank you so gently the paper blushed. We pinned both notes on the mantel between the flour jar and a little lighthouse peg I whittled on days when knives behave. The mantel looked like a procession of good nouns: letter, bloom, light. We took green to market chipping, because peace has errand lists. Letty's bakery wore its triumph like steam. She pressed buns into our hands without asking for coin, and asked with sisterly bluntness whether Howl was eating or merely performing digestion. Eating, Sophie said, which is the only praise that ever matters to kitchens. I bought a spool of strong thread, the colour of admitted sky, and Letty threw in a ribbon the right red. For hats or heroes, she shrugged. Heroes prefer not to be told apart from hats. At the hat shop, the window had rearranged itself since the last time Sophie looked through it with the narrative of a former life. The display told a quieter story now. Workmanlike felts, sensible brims, a single extravagant feather that seemed to remember a storm. Sophie stood with her stick the stick had learned to be a companion rather than a crutch, and smiled as if she had finally been invited to sit in her own parlour. We did not go in. Some rooms are best revisited by the heart first. Back home, Howl engineered a day for small victories. He coaxed a sulking hinge into manners with oil and 3 words, "Even hinges respect." You were right. He tuned the wings to fold tighter, not because we feared sky, but because we trusted ground. He brought inside a ladder that had been feeling unnecessary. Tools, he told me, sulk when ignored. I apologized to the broom. It pretended to accept. The witch of the waste, who had taken up residence in a chair by the fire as if chairs were the last diplomacy she trusted, began to teach me domestic sorceries that require only attention. Never wind-thread angry, she said, or it will remember. She showed me how to measure twice and cut once, and then measure again anyway, if the cloth looks like it intends to argue. She drifted toward afternoons like a person discovering that days can be counted without dread. When she slept, her hands relaxed as if finally excused from applause. We flew a little at dusk, never far, because joy should be exercised the way one exercises dogs, not to make it heel, but to keep it friendly. The castle's wings raised us over hedges that rehearsed their greenness, over a pond practicing mirrors, over fields where scarecrows had gone back to meaningful work. We waved to a shepherd who waved back as if we were the sort of weather he approved. Sophie laughed into the wind, and the wind, being decent lately, did not take it personally. The ring on Sophie's hand warmed now and then, not a summons, only the memory of maps. She turned it when looking for the kettle, which amused Calcifer. He claims the ring knows where boiling happens because it has learned who boils first. The black notch remained wrapped in cloth, no longer a threat. Now a shelf where history stands politely until invited to speak. We opened white every day out of gratitude. The meadow kept its bees conversant, and its grasses willing to hold our spines the way chairs do, without demanding to be noticed. We counted swallows. We counted breaths. We did not count promises. We kept them. Kingsbury invited us this time with please inked correctly. Madame Suleiman received us in a room that had traded mirrors for windows. Your household, she said, with a glance that included broom and fire and stubborn rails, has been observed to prefer verbs like keep and mend. Howl bowed the length appropriate to policy and no further. Sophie's bow was the sort that makes palaces consider adding aprons to their heraldry. Keep and mend, she agreed, also boil. Suleiman's smile was the kind my son calls unclassified. We will attempt to support boiling, she said. It was the most intelligent treaty I have heard. On the way back through Red, we tilted the latch and opened briefly to the prince, waist-deep in the administrative swamp that grows after wars. He looked thinner and better for it, the excess gone, the exactness of purpose remaining. Rooms have been returned to their names, he reported. I am learning to speak softly enough to be heard. Sophie offered him bread. Howl offered him the name of a smith who repairs roofs without trying to improve sky. Peace is this, passing along good nouns. The Dogsour original and Suleiman's rehabilitated gentleman became a club. They negotiated rugs, invented patrol routes, and enforced nap equity, with rigours parliaments could study. When children from the hill visited, the dogs supervised petting and returned each child to the door with a look that said, "We have documented your gentleness for future reference." I taught the younger one to wait for a hand signal before indulging in biscuits. He taught me that joy, once trained, remains exuberant within rules, on a Tuesday that behaved like a Sunday. Sophie's curse forgot itself long enough to show the face we had all been treating as a memory. It happened mid-sentence while she was scolding Calcifer for scorning perfectly good beech logs. Her hair forgot winter. Her back remembered other numbers. She kept scolding until she noticed none of us were properly pretending not to notice. Then she looked at Howl the way a well-made key looks at a door. He, for once, did not make a speech. He looked relieved, which is the most beautiful a vain man can be. "There you are," he said. "Here," she corrected, "which is even better. We celebrated by doing what saved us the first time. Chores." I swept with reverence. Howl fixed the latch on the cupboard that had always chosen to be a test of patience. Sophie kneaded bread, as if proving that hands that have stitched and scolded and carried and commanded can also persuade flour to behave. Calcifer burned the colour of a story that plans to be told at a table, not a podium. But we still wonder whether a castle that has flown remembers not to float above the work, whether hearts, freshly domesticated, will keep the schedule when storms go out of fashion, whether peace can wear an apron long enough to be considered style rather than phase. I wonder this while washing platters that have learned both scarcity and feast, and now prefer modest abundance. 3 brief proofs from the Republic of Ordinary. First, the geranium attempted to become 2 plants. Sophie helped it without making a speech about resilience, and now both pots behave as if they'd always been promised. Second, a hinge I had underestimated remained silent for 3 days. I wrote it a thank you on a label and stuck the note where only it would see. Third, a child on the hill brought us a drawing of the castle with wings. He had drawn the shadow bowing. We taped it to the cupboard, and the cupboard stood straighter for an hour. We visited Porthaven because gratitude needs salt. Nets hung like confessions forgiven. Boats argued amiably with ropes. The women at the quay told us how many repairs a coastal town can stomach before it becomes art. Howl mended a boy's toy ship with an unbeautiful knot that will outlive fashion. Sophie bought fish and a lesson in vinegar. I bought 2 lemons because lists had begun to include hospitality as a staple. That night, the castle practiced stillness with new skill. The wings tucked themselves with the self-respect of tools that know when not to be relevant. The legs chose a foothold that let cups remember their places. Calcifer banked into a deliberate emberth shade. I now call keeping trust. The witch fell asleep, telling me not to praise thread aloud. I put the praise in my notebook instead. Howl and Sophie stood at the door and touched each colour once, then each other's hands once, the way devout people touch holy water without asking it to perform. I opened my notebook and copied a charm titled "For Teaching Peace to Work Indoors." Ingredients: a broom that knows your voice, oil for the hinge that admits neighbours, a kettle that sings on time, one field of bees visited daily, a red setting that only opens for pleas, a black setting wrapped in cloth and used, if at all, to thank the past, 3 buns from a sister, 2 polite dogs, 1 stubborn flower in a sunnier sill, and the habit of boiling water first. Before sleeping, Sophie wrote a new list apricots, if any, clothespins, patience, and slid it under the sugar. Howl placed his boots side by side with the care of a man who has learned where he returns. The dogs arrange themselves like commas. They know we are not done speaking. The meadow sighed bees into the window. The door, polished by our hours, shone exactly as much as a door should. We blew out the lamp. The castle breathed. Tomorrow, green for errands, blue for salt, red for only if, white for yes, black for gratitude. We would sweep. We would mend. We would keep refusing cruelty with cups and chores. And when anyone asked what magic sustained us, we would answer with the porridge spoon. This one. Peace makes noise differently. It clinks cups on saucers, hammers, persuading nails into the future, children practicing the grammar of outside. The castle learned the new meter quickly. The legs stepped less like urgency and more like errands. The wings kept modest. The door polished itself where our sleeves had already started the job. Calcifer adopted the shade of blue that means I am busy being needed. Howl sang to the kettle, not for artenly to check the weather of its whistle. Sophie wrote a list apricots, if any, clothespins, patience. Tell Letty the yeast behaved and tucked it behind the sugar because sweetness is the safest clerk. Kingsbury invited us to an apology parade, not the official name, but the proper one. A procession where uniforms remembered they were merely good coats, where floats carried tools instead of trophies, where officials walked on foot to test their humility. Madame Suleiman met us at a corner where the shade was generous. She had lost 2 mirrors and gained 4 windows. Her face preferred it. We are instituting a policy of kettles, she said, dry humour that looked good on her. Sophie approved the policy and promised to contribute steam. Howl bowed as if to say, you will have hours when you are tired. The prince rode past without a crown, looking like a man who has learned to make rooms quiet by speaking softly. He dismounted to greet Turnip Head, who had returned to his post on our hill long enough to accept thanks. It pleased me that a nation remembered to bow to a scarecrow. Children threw flowers with more accuracy than politics ever manages. One blossom fell onto Howl's shoulder, and he let it stay, obedient at last to the modest law of petals. We opened the red notch that evening only wide enough to let the parade pass through our kitchen as a rumour. Then we turned to green because errands wait for no treaty. Market chipping felt like a room after guests' chairs put back, laughter folded, small messes enjoyed before being cleaned. Letty pressed apricot tarts on us. They had the taste I now call ceasefire. Still sweet, still surprised. A woman at the stall next door sold needles with the pride of a cartographer. Sophie bought a packet and promised them honourable work. I bought a whistle for the kettle, in case destiny forgot its cue. Calcifer scoffed and then asked to try it. Back home, we walked the boundary of our small world to see where it held and where it invited. Howl tuned the wings to tuck tighter. Sophie rubbed beeswax into the rails so they would remember to glide. Rails, like sentences, sometimes scrape until praised. The Witch of the Waste slept near the hearth, hands open, teaching me the etiquette of endings. Sit by the heat, forgive yourself for mistaking applause for love. Learn the names of the quiet things. When she woke, she showed me how to bind spines of old books so they stop announcing their pain, and I loved her for that more than anything she had ever worn. In the afternoon, paper birds arrived with new manners, folded into cranes and tied with cotton thread. Suleiman had sent a note. Your household is registered as a place of repair. We posted the paper on the cupboard where the child's drawing of our shadow bowing already lived. The cupboard stood finer for the promotion. Howl, who can be frivolous with certificates, tucked this one behind the flour tin, announcing that repairs honour bread. People began to find us, not crowds, pilgrims of small needs. A sailor with a boot that had lost faith in its heel. A seamstress whose thimble remembered somebody else's finger. A boy who had forgotten where his toy ship was brave. They came by green or were brought by neighbours who had learned how to point with kindness. We kept a bench at the door that understood it was a gate to dignity. Sophie ran the queue with tea and the firm generosity of a just queen. Howl took the stubborn cases and charmed materials into listening. I measured thread, labelled jars, and practised the pleasure of being almost necessary. The ring on Sophie's hand warmed when gratitude grew dense. She would turn it once, not for maps now, only as a way to breathe with memory. The black notch stayed wrapped, but occasionally, when we were done keeping and mending for the day, Sophie would lay her palm on it and say, "Thank you for waiting." Doors, like dogs, understand tone. It shone a little under the cloth. One blue morning we went to Port Haven because salt is a sacrament. The piers had learned how to yawn without breaking. Nets lay like patient handwriting on the quay. A child showed me a knot his grandfather had taught him. Plain, honest, impossible to improve. I traded him the bowline. We shook on the lesson with the solemnity children reserve for new words. Sophie bought vinegar and news. Howl returned a toy boat repaired in a way that would forgive the sea for trying. We ate bread and sardines by the water and agreed that fish have the right idea about listening silently to light. Climbing the hill home, the dogs performed a small satire of duty by leading from behind. At the door, 2 women waited carrying a mirror in a blanket, the other carrying her own reflection in her tired face. "It broke on the day they took my son," she said. "We have glued it, but it won't tell the truth." Sophie set the mirror on the table as one sets a guest. Howl spoke to it politely, asking it to remember glass before glamour. Calcifer warmed it like sun through a window. I mixed a thin paste of egg white and patience. We worked until the room became quiet. When the woman looked in, the glass offered her the dignified face of someone who had done too many brave things in private. She cried, then laughed, then paid with apples none of us would allow. We kept the apples anyway. Hospitality is rude if it refuses gifts. That evening, Madame Suleiman visited as a citizen. She stood in our doorway with her hat off and her hands empty. "I have come to borrow a kettle," she said, formal as a poem. Sophie handed her ours, and they smiled at each other like equals in a guild. "We are very good at kettles," Sophie replied. "It's policy," said Suleiman, and she left as if remembering the pleasure of being the person and not the office. I will record for the file that Sophie's curse had mostly loosened by now, but it was stubborn in certain corners, the way dust is constitutional. Some mornings she kept one hand on the stick, and the stick behaved like a friend. On those mornings, Howl moved more slowly, not pity. Pacing, he filled the basins and warmed the water and performed the choreography of cups with the care he once saved for hair. He allowed himself no speech about it, which is how you know he had learned. But we still wonder whether the habit of flight will tempt us away from work when skies blush, whether peace, which is so good at clinking, remembers to creak when hinges need oil, whether the better story, keep, mend, boil can stay interesting enough that we do not go looking for storms to feel important. 3 short proofs from the Republic of Ordinary. First, I oversalted soup. Sophie corrected it with a boiled potato and forgiveness. We called it education and finished the pot. Second, the geranium insisted on turning toward light even after we moved it to test its convictions. I marked the sill with chalk like a sailor mapping a current. Third, Howl apologized to a ladder for calling it useless. The ladder forgave him with 2 impeccable rungs. We flew 1 inch at sunset, my request. The castle lifted just enough to show the meadow our competence, and then settled to demonstrate our restraint. Under us, bees continued their civics. Over us, swallows wrote cursive on sky. Sophie stood at the threshold with a hand on each colour. Green for errands, blue for salt, red for please only, white for yes, black wrapped for gratitude. She touched each once with the patience of a cantor. Howl stood beside her and did the same, a man finally fond of the rituals that keep him kind. After supper, the witch told me a last lesson. Never praise thread aloud, she reminded, and do not ask fire to be interesting. Then she slept with her hands folded like she was agreeing to stay. Calcifer banked low and called it comfort. I wrote in my notebook a charm titled For Keeping Triumph from Becoming Pose. Sweep the threshold, thank the hinge, open white once, close red with manners, return borrowed kettles promptly, fold tarts in napkins for neighbours, teach one child a knot. Under all circumstances, boil water first. Before bed, Howl set his boots side by side. Sophie placed a tart on a plate and covered it with a bowl for morning. The dogs spelled home again with their naps. They deny it, but floors can read. The door shone exactly where our hands live. The castle breathed. Tomorrow, green for errands, blue for salt, red for diplomacy, if it remembers, please, white for bees, and yes, black for thanks only. We will sweep, mend, label, listen. We will keep refusing cruelty with cups and chores. And if anyone asks what magic holds us up, I will answer with the kettle tapping the lid. This. The castle began to collect thank yous, the way fences collect ribbons after a country fair. Modest, colourful, tied by quick hands. A jar of pickles from a widow whose kettle began to sing again. A skein of yarn from a shepherdess who said wolves now keep their opinions in the hills. A letter without flower fingerprints, rare, that read, "Your bench made me braver." Sophie arranged these at the edge of the mantel beside the little lighthouse peg, and the jar marked living room light, as if gratitude should be displayed where it could supervise the fire. Calcifer hummed his approval. He likes to know his work is seen. A morning came when the Witch of the Waste woke and asked, in the voice of someone finally hungry for honest things, whether we had a task that would not remember her former introductions. Sophie gave her mending. "Patch this lap blanket," she said, "for a child who prefers windows." The witch studied the tear, then the thread, then me. "Bring me the needle that respects quiet," she instructed. I did, holding it by the eye as she taught. Her hands moved cautiously, then with growing competence. The blanket accepted the patch the way a story accepts a new paragraph that solves a problem you forgot you had. When she finished, she did not look to be praised. "There," she said, and the blanket said it back in wool. Kingsbury sent us a plaque we did not hang too official, too polished. We kept it under the flower tin where it steadied the shelf. Howl named this civil service, which is his term for putting pomp to domestic use. He spent the afternoon talking to the castle's hinges, coaxing out a complaint in a lower cupboard that had been embarrassed to squeak. "You were right," he told it. "He is getting very good at those 3 words. Doors adore him now, which is a mixed blessing." We opened blue because salt teaches patience. Porthaven had recovered the art of leaning on rails without staring at horizons as if they owed an answer. A boy brought his toy ship to be re-ruddered. I watched Howl choose a knot, unhandsome and true. "Beauty is a phase," he told the boat. "Reliability is a character." The boat, properly chastened, floated a pan of water on the quay like a graduate waving politely. Sophie bought vinegar and news. The news was small and correct, that a pair of gulls had decided to share a post, that a fisherman's daughter had started mending nets for pay, that the bakery on the pier had remembered cinnamon on Thursdays. We carried home bread and the smell of harbourside competence. At market chipping via green, Letty pressed into Sophie's palm a key. "For when you finally come in and sit," she said, meaning the hat shop's back door and also a wider country. Sophie closed her fingers around the metal. "Soon," she promised, "not like a wish, like a date, on a calendar." I bought clothespins, patience in wood, and a small tin whistle for the kettle in case storytelling kept us distracted at boiling moments. The shopkeeper added a spool of thread on the house, and Sophie gave her a look that turned the phrase from metaphor to housing. We improved the wings, not larger, only kinder to the rails they share space with. Howl tightened 2 bolts and loosened one, the exact measure that turns contraption into carriage. We lifted for 1 breath and set down no showmanship. Just an exercise, the way singers warm a scale, so conversation will be pleasant all day. The dogs approved with a coordinated blink. The ring on Sophie's hand warmed and cooled like a sleeping pulse. I have not told you about the book cupboard. We found it in the debris after the castle's difficult adjustment, a small case with hinges sulking. Inside, a cluster of volumes that had learned to mutter metaphors at one another. The bindings were tired and opinionated. The witch taught me to reback a spine with linen and paste while not humiliating the original thread. "Books," she said, "remember how you touch them." I practiced until my hands moved like librarians who also bake. We shelved the mended books near the bench for waiting visitors. People read while tea brewed, every cup cooled to a better temperature for conversation. The prince sent his third note, shorter than before, the way confidence shrinks itself when it no longer needs to audition. Roads open, carpets returned, bells repaired. He added almost shyly, "Come to the square when the clocks are honest." We traded glances, Howl, Sophie, me, even the dogs, and agreed clocks had behaved admirably lately. We went by red, which now smelled less of orders and more of invitations. The square hosted a market of returns, stray tools finding their owners, apprentices being reassigned to ordinary futures, a kettle exchange. Some were adopted on the spot. Madame Suleiman stood with her hat off, receiving kettles as if they were petitions, and returning them as if they were verdicts. She borrowed ours again for an hour. "Policy requires boiling," she said. "We are catching up." A woman brought a mirror like the one we had treated earlier, this time not broken, only mean. "It shows me the version of myself who cannot rest," she confessed. Sophie turned the mirror to face the wall. "Give it a day of not being looked into," she advised. "Some truths improve when they are not asked to perform." The woman returned 2 days later to report success. She gave Sophie apricots and an apology for ever doubting sugar. We made a tart and invited 3 neighbours to test our theory that pastry persuades rooms towards citizenship. The black notch remained wrapped but close. Sometimes Sophie rested her palm there, and the door behaved like a dog permitted to keep watch from the threshold. Satisfied, unjealous, useful. I once asked her if she wished to open it again. "Not for proof," she said, "only for thanks." And thanks is already visiting. She went to wipe the table, and the table eager shone. Calcifer found new games in restraint, holding a simmer without sulk, switching to a lower vowel when a baby slept on the bench, warming a needle so it slid through stubborn fabric. Finesse, he called it, and demanded we admire him as if he had invented subtlety. We obliged. Fire should be praised when it decides not to be interesting. A small incident to record. A child arrived carrying a hat that had belonged to someone gone. She asked if we could make it not hurt to wear. Sophie steamed it over the kettle and reshaped the crown with slow, exact pressure. I held the brim steady. Howl spoke softly to the felt, as if reminding it of its first day. The child put it on, and her face grew 1 year lighter. "What did you do?" she asked. "We remembered it," Sophie said. The child paid us with 2 buttons and a story about a cat who had learned to sleep on the map of a town, as if promising to keep it warm. We considered the debt settled, but we still wonder whether peace-busy, clinking, decent can survive the vanity of memory, whether a house that now knows how to keep will resist showing off how it kept, whether hearts, having been returned, will quietly report for work when the applause has found other jobs. I wonder this while oiling a hinge that now remembers to be grateful and polishing the handle that remembers to be plural. 3 small proofs from the Republic of Ordinary. First, I salted soup properly on the first try, and Sophie looked at me as if I had graduated. I bowed to the ladle, which likes compliments. Second, the geranium divided again. I potted the new plant in a mug that had lost its handle, and both behaved as if nothing essential was missing. Third, the dogs brought us a glove. They had found the owner too, and were merely inviting us to witness the reunion. We applauded with biscuits. We opened white as we do, and the meadow agreed to host our backs. Bees argued ideas, not identities. Howl lay with his hands behind his head, the very picture of a man who has finally found a use for sky beyond mirrors. Sophie counted swallows, and then closed her eyes, as if to balance the counting. I practiced the bowline until my fingers could tie it while listening to someone else's need. The ring warmed like a memory that knows when to keep quiet. Evening softened edges. We pulled in the ladder before it felt unnecessary. Howl adjusted the wings and then deliberately did not open them. He went instead to the hinge that had been faithful all day and thanked it with a drop of oil. Sophie wrote a list: soap, lemons, knit needles if we find good ones, and added at the bottom, visit the door at dusk. Say, thank you. She tucked the paper under the sugar. Calcifer banked low into the colour. I call keeping watch without fuss. The witch slept beside a basket of wool, mouth faintly smiling as if scolding thread in dreams. I wrote in my notebook a charm titled, For Remembering What Saved You After the Saving. Sweep the threshold daily. Keep a bench. Praise hinges. Return kettles. Open white at least once. Keep red on please. Store black under cloth and gratitude. Teach one knot. Mend one book. Refuse spectacle. Boil water first. I underline the last because habits are the only spells that last past applause. Before we slept, Howl and Sophie stood at the door and touched each colour with a finger as steady as punctuation. Green for errands, blue for salt, red only for invitations, white because yes, black for thanks. Their hands found each other in the space between colours and rested there. The door shone where our hours have lived. The castle breathed. Tomorrow we would open markets and nets and bees, mend what arrives, and send home those who stay long enough to remember the way. And if anyone asked what magic we practice, I would lift the kettle and let its lid answer, this one. Autumn rehearsed itself on the hill with a patience we could imitate. The grass kept its green, but admitted a little gold around the edges. The sky remembered to be blue only after breakfast. The castle approved of this moderate weather legs. Agreeable, rails dignified, wings folded with the humility of tools that know they may be wanted, but not today. Calcifer adopted the working blue of comfortable heat and consented to simmer without commentary. Howl tuned a hinge with the tenderness you would reserve for a friend's shoulder. Sophie wrote a list: soap, lemons, knit needles if we find good ones. Return Letty's tart tin and tucked it, as doctrine requires, behind the sugar. The bench at our door had become a minor institution. People came not for marvels, but for repairs that remembered them. A kettle whose lid had learned to be shy. A coat that wanted its button to keep a promise. A book whose spine had opinions. We had added a little sign, painted with the steadiness of a hand that prefers verbs. Keep and mend. Madame Suleiman walked up one noon with her hat off and the posture of a citizen. I have a minutes book, she said, that has decided to forget its minutes. Sophie received the ledger like a patient. We prescribe paste, linen, and tea, she decided. Suleiman laughed, not the palace laugh, the human one, and left us to our surgery. We travelled green because market chipping knows which errands teach peace its manners. Letty returned our empty tin and filled it with nothing. Which is how sisters insist you take it back full. The hat shop wants a visit, she said, handing Sophie a key we already owned but needed to receive again. We went by the long way, as if the door could learn patience through our steps. In the window sat a felt, with a single featherstorm-coloured, honest balanced on a brim that knew streets. Sophie looked once, not to measure herself against the past, only to check the angle. "All right," she told the glass. We did not go in. The key warmed in her palm like a pet waiting by a future chair. Blue opened to Port Haven for salt and to practice listening where gulls do not flatter. Nets sprawled like paragraphs edited for clarity. A boy we had once taught a bowline tugged my sleeve and showed me a sheet bend sturdy enough to persuade Weather to reconsider. I applauded with a biscuit. He approved our method. Sophie bought vinegar and a story about a lantern that had chosen a widow's porch because it preferred her evenings. Howl repaired a cracked barometer with the patience of a man who now believes air on its own terms. "You're behaving," he told the instrument. "Continue." Back home, a woman arrived with a clock that had kept loud company through the war and now refused to tick unless shouted at. "It is tired of alarms," Sophie diagnosed. Howl opened the back and spoke to the escapement as if negotiating a truce. Calcifer breathed a thread of warmth across the gears. "I set a cup of water beside it. Clocks like to know someone is practicing mercy." It resumed with a more courteous tick. "We can work with courteous," the woman said, and left us apples as proof that barter improves even manners. The Witch of the Waste had discovered ambition appropriate to chairs and wool. She took on blankets for children with windows and catalogued the needles by mood. "This one tolerates haste," she would tell me. "This one punishes it." I learned not to praise thread aloud. I wrote my compliments where only the cloth could overhear. She slept often, mouth relaxed as if giving back applause she had stolen from herself years ago. When she woke, she showed me how to backstitch a secret. Neat, durable, dignified. Toward evening, a Weather without uniform gathered its skirts over the distant hills and put down rain with an honest hand. The castle shifted weight as good buildings do when earth thinks of becoming water. A shepherd banged up our path with a shawl-wrapped bundle. Inside, a toy lamb whose wooden leg had lost interest in ambition. "It's my girls," he said, embarrassed at being tender in public. Howl fitted the dowel with a sleeve of linen glue, soft as apology. "Let it rest by the fire," Sophie said. We set the lamb near Calcifer, who pretended to be indifferent and was exactly warm enough. We tried the wings for a breath, not to impress the clouds, who had their own work, but to carry 3 baskets of mending to a cottage whose roof had discovered humility. The castle rose on a small courage and settled with the pride of a well-placed teacup. A child waved. The dogs waved back with tails. On the return descent, the rails hummed a satisfied note. Rails enjoy cooperating with air when no one demands heroics. The ring on Sophie's hand warmed once that week, not a summons. Only a map's sigh when someone reads it gently. She turned the stone, and the warmth drifted to the white notch. We opened to the meadow, which has never once asked for news. We lay with our backs to forgiveness and counted swallows until numbers remembered how to be birds. "We could live here," I said. "We do," Sophie answered, not confusing floorboards with home. The prince sent a short note stamped by rain. courts less noisy, roads honest, bells still learning humility, he added a line I liked. Teach me which hinges to thank. We replied with a drawing of our door's collars and instructions. Green for errands, blue for salt, red only if please, white for yes, black for thanks under cloth. Madame Suleiman sent back a sketch of a kettle and the word implemented. I have begun to suspect policy might survive if it is built of cups. One afternoon brought our first quarrel since the roof learned good manners. It was about nothing. Howl's coat on a chair that had just learned posture. My habit of over-labelling, coriander does not like to be called courage, though the jars coexist. Sophie's insistence that ladders be praised before they are used. Voices rose exactly one notch. The dogs, shocked by the breach of indoor democracy, left the room and returned with the bench, which they pushed until it tapped our shin sit. We obeyed. Sophie boiled water. Howl apologized to the chair and to the room for the echo. I took the courage label off the coriander and put it on the broom where it belongs. By the time the kettle had learned the note, Peace stood in the doorway, pretending it had been there all along. Calcifer asked later if we would like to see him be free for a minute. He popped only a little from the grate, a blue coin flipping and returning with the pleased sound of metal recognizing pocket. I can visit chimneys, he bragged when invited. We congratulated him with restraint. Fire should not be applauded into recklessness. He simmered, happy to be both employed and unowned. Business at the bench taught us a way of blessing without litanies. We set a rule. No one leaves without tea. No one pays what they cannot part with twice. No one's story is used as decoration. A sailor left a compass that preferred candor. We cleaned it of bravado and returned it pointing to north without speeches. A child brought a hat and asked if it might be made to remember birthdays. Sophie tucked a stitch in the band and whispered, "On." The hat behaved. The child promised to return with a drawing of us being useful. We pretended not to preen, but we still wonder whether a house that becomes a practice will resist becoming a performance, whether hearts, once commended for returning, will keep reporting for shifts when applause trades jobs, whether the better story, keep, mend, boil, can apprentice boredom without losing wonder. I wonder this while rubbing beeswax into the rails and letting them tell me when enough is quiet. 3 proofs from the Republic of Ordinary. First, I baked a loaf that rose as if remembering a promise. Sophie knocked its bottom and accepted its credentials. Second, the geranium decided to bloom on a day rain auditioned for permanence. We moved it to the centre like a visiting dignitary and said nothing grand. Third, the kettle refused to whistle until Howl hummed the right interval. He apologized for expecting it to be psychic, and it forgave him in steam. Evening found us in our usual litany. Howl adjusted the hinges until silence performed convincingly. Sophie wrote a list nails, lemons, wool, the exact grey of patient weather. Take the hat shop key for a walk and slid it under the sugar, because sweetness keeps promises in a drawer. The witch dreamed with her hands open over a basket of mending. The dogs spelled home again with naps. Calcifer banked into the low blue of keeping watch. I copied a charm titled For Houses That Refuse to Be Spectacle. Bench at the door. Cups within reach. Names on jars that mean what they mean. Praise for hinges, not only doors. White opened daily. Red opened rarely and with please. Black touched at dusk for thanks. And because the universe loves a refrain, boil water first. Before we slept, we visited the door the way people visit a shrine because they like what it does to their posture. Green for errands, blue for salt, red for consent, white because yes, black because thank you. We touched each colour once, then each other's hands once. The door shone where our hours live. The castle breathed. Tomorrow we would open markets and nets and bees, teach one knot, mend one book, return one kettle, forgive one chair, and write one more line that makes a day behave. And if anyone asked the spell, I would lift the ladle and answer with its humble grammar, this. Winter arrived with clean pockets. The hill learned a quieter green. Frost practised calligraphy on the railings. The sky folded itself with the care of good linen. The castle liked the season legs settled, wings patient, door polished by sleeves that had discovered the pleasure of wool. Calcifer adopted the blue of punctual heat. Howl tuned a hinge until it made no sound, then thanked it anyway. Sophie wrote a list-nails lemons, wool the grey of patient weather, carry the hat shop key, warm the bench, and tucked it beneath the sugar. The bench, newly rubbed with oil, understood its office, to turn waiting into belonging. We had become a map people trusted. Fishermen brought boots that remembered storms. Seamstresses brought thimbles that had lost confidence. A child brought a wooden cow missing one ear and asked if we knew where hearing lives. In balance, Sophie said, and glued on a small ear with quiet glue. Howl returned kettles with improved opinions. I copied names on labels with a hand that had learned to spell mercy without flourish. On an afternoon the colour of pewter, Sophie put the hat shop key in my palm. "Let's walk," she said. We took green and let market chipping discover us without fanfare. The shop waited with the politeness of furniture that has learned to forgive. We unlocked the back door. Dust lifted like a shy audience. The counter stood where it always had an altar to surprises finished on schedule. Sophie touched the work table as if checking a pulse. "It is not asking for us," she said. "It is only asking for care." We swept. We opened a window. We folded cloth until it obeyed. She hung the key on a peg with no ceremony, turned to the room and blessed it with a sentence that has never failed this household. "Boil water first." That night, the Witch of the Waste put her hand on the basket of mending and said she would like to sleep longer than a nap. Sophie tucked a blanket to her chin and called the blanket by its right name. The witch smiled with the dignity of someone who has finally learned when applause should end. She slept. Calcifer kept the kind of heat a friend deserves. The dogs kept the kind of watch a door understands. The prince sent one last short note. "Clocks honest, bells modest. Come if you like, stay if you must." Madame Suleiman borrowed our kettle and returned it with a ribbon the exact red of permission. We tied it to the wall peg and called it policy. People kept arriving with troubles that could be solved by hands and tea. A sailor asked if he might sit without speaking. He sat. He left his thanks folded into the bench like a page marker. We flew once more just above hedges because joy, like a good coat, should be worn out of doors occasionally. The wings rose and settled with a satisfaction that did not try to be applause. The white notch opened to the meadow as if it had been waiting for our backs. We lay down. B's faithful bureaucrats of sweetness wrote minutes in the air. "Do you think we will always live like this?" I asked. "As long as we keep choosing," Sophie said. Howl rolled a shoulder as if adjusting sky. "And as long as hinges stay praised," he added. Calcifer, dignified, hummed assent. But we still wonder whether a house that has learned to keep will remember to keep when no one is watching. Whether hearts, now punctual, will keep showing up to the small shifts when storms go out of fashion. Whether the better story keep, mend, boil can outlast the vanity of achievement and remain merely correct. I wonder this while oiling a hinge that thanks me by staying quiet. A little air for laughter. I tried to teach the dogs to bring a specific glove. They brought both gloves and one modest shoe. Howl attempted to charm the clock into a waltz. It counter-offered with a reliable march. Sophie baked a loaf so earnest the knife paused to reconsider its vocation. The year turned. The frost withdrew with the courtesy of an honoured guest. We put the bench out earlier and brewed more cups than gossip. The book cupboard admitted it wanted company. I mended 2 spines and put a ribbon where readers could keep their place without folding corners. The geranium divided again, generous as conviction. The mug without handle proved once more that usefulness survives aesthetics. The door's collars shone beneath our routine touch. Green for errands, blue for salt, red only when please arrives first, white for yes, black for thanks, wrapped in cloth. Evening, and then the long evening that closes a story without closing a life. The castle breathed slower. Howl set his boots side by side and did not polish them, which is one form of trust. Sophie wrote a last list for the day apricots, if any. Patience, even if none, and slipped it, where sweetness keeps confidences. Calcifer banked into the shade I call keeping oath. The witch slept with her hands open, having at last agreed to let Thread finish the sentence. The dogs spelled home again in their fluent grammar of naps. I took my notebook to the table and wrote the charm we have been practicing without ink. For going on. Ingredients: a bench at the door, cups within reach. Names on jars that mean what they mean. Rails rubbed with wax until they remember to glide. A ladder apologized to before use. A ring that warms to gratitude more than to maps. A field visited daily, even if only in the sentence where you breathe. 5 colours touched in order: green, blue, red, if please, white, black for thanks, and without which nothing holds boil water first. Sophie stood at the threshold, touched each colour once, and then rested her palm on the black cloth. She did not open. "Thank you," she whispered to the past for being exact enough to teach, to the present for permitting chores, to a future that will need the same verbs. Howl came beside her and did the same, his hand quieter than his reputation. The door shone where we have lived our hours. We took our places. Sophie at the kettle, Howl by the hinge. Me at the drawer where labels wait for new nouns. Calcifer in the grate with the pride of a fire that can be trusted not to perform. The bench made room for tomorrow. The meadow folded bees into sleep. The town rehearsed waking bread. The sky kept its blue somewhere safe for morning. This is the part where stories tend to tip into hymns. We will resist. We will keep the ritual that saved us. Sweep, mend, label, listen. When a knock arrives, we will answer with clean hands. When a voice demands, we will open only on please. When memory aches, we will touch white and let bees instruct us in committees. When pride scratches at the sill, we will oil the hinge and praise it for patience. When sorrow sits, we will keep a bench and tea. When doors ask how to be faithful, we will show them the places our sleeves have made bright. The kettle ticks. The room settles. Sophie's hand finds Howl's for a breath, then returns to the handle that pours. I turn down the lamp a little to give the doorway its star. Calcifer hums the key of keeping. Outside, the hill practices the long word ongoing until it loses its syllables and becomes landscape. If you find yourself near a threshold and the day has been braver than you hoped, you may borrow our grammar. Touch green and do the errand that returns someone to themselves. Touch blue and remember salt. Touch red only for invitations that begin with please. Touch white because yes is a virtue when spoken carefully. Touch black for thanks, not proof. Keep a bench. Name things by their names. Boil water first. Good night from a castle that walks by choice and rests by consent. From a hearth that has learned restraint and pride together. From a door polished where many hands have said here. We will be ready in the morning. The first cups will be for those who come needing only to sit. The second will be for mending. The third for telling the truth softly so it stays. And if you listen closely as the lamp goes down, you may hear what we have heard every evening since choosing this story. A house breathing, a hinge keeping its promise, and a small, steady whisper at the threshold go on.